dreams, I walk free in the city streets. 2,500 days plus 50 weeks, doing hard time for these WikiLeaks, trying to bring the truth out. Man, it only gets you heat, and then they gag you. You don't get to speak, and when you get the leak, they try to hit delete. The masses of the masses, they want the shit discreet. That's why my middle finger's up to these sick elites. Free speech, it's the freedom of press. Take your deepest, darkest secrets, never leave them unsaid. If I'm a thief, then I'm a thief for the people you dread. The people of the red, white and blue, you keep them in bed. Seeing the sheep, keep them asleep, deceiving the weak. Keep seeking the leaks till you cease, and I see your defeat. Until I'm deceased underneath a freezing red sheet. Become a dead man, then I hit the switch and release. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor, you kill the messenger. Stories axed by the editor, you kill the messenger. Pay to play on the regular, you kill the messenger. Need a solace, any questioners, you kill the messenger. And outside my window a figure quickly creeps. They dark as night like some motherfucking chimney sweeps. Whiskey with my Mickey keeps dying in my kidneys weak. Silence of my risky tweets is what the grand jury seeks. I'm wanting peace like 7 years in Tibet. Now rest in peace like 7 years under threat. Cause I've released 7 vaults, they upset. They ended the rape sentence, but the US still insists to rest. I guess it's a sin to take the truth and disseminate. MLK to Gandhi, take aim and eliminate. And I don't say I'm great, just wanna say what's fake. But if they kill me, a million others will take my place. The CIA's post like a knife the sharpest. All hypocrisy, lies, and heartless. They want to stop me, my life make my heart quit. Cause democracy dies in the darkness. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor, you kill the messenger. Stories axed by the editor, you kill the messenger. Pay to play on the regular, you kill the messenger. Need a solace, any questioners, you kill the messenger. When the vote count is irregular, you kill the messenger. You caught spying on a senator, you kill the messenger. Removing voters from the register, you kill the messenger. Need a solace, any questioners, you kill the messenger.
Kill the messenger. Kill the messenger. Kill the messenger.
In my dreams, I walk free in the city streets. 2,500 days plus 50 weeks, doing hard time for these WikiLeaks, trying to bring the truth out. Man, it only gets you heat, and then they gag you. You don't get to speak, and when you get the leak, they try to hit delete. The masses of the masses, they want the shit discreet. That's why my middle finger's up to these sick elites. Playing on the regular,
You kill the messenger.
free speech is the freedom of press. Take your deepest, darkest secrets, never leave them unsaid. If I'm a thief, then I'm a thief for the people you dread. The people of the red, white and blue, you keep them in bed. Seeking the sheep, keep them asleep, deceiving the weak. Keep seeking the leaks till you cease, and I see your defeat. Until I'm deceased underneath a freezer red sheet. Become a dead man, then I hit the switch and release. When Goldman Sachs is your creditor,
Kill the messenger.
Outside my window, a figure quickly creeps. They dark as night like some motherfucking chimney sweeps. Whiskey with my Mickey keeps, dying in my kidneys weak. Silence of my risky tweets, what the grand jury seeks. I'm wanting peace, like 7 years in Tibet. Now rest in peace, like 7 years under threat. Cause I released 7 balls, they upset, they ended the rape sentence. But the US still insists arrest. I guess it's a sin to take the truth and disseminate. And I'll pay the Gandhi, take him and eliminate. And I don't say I'm great, just wanna say what's fake. But if they kill me, a million others will take my place. The CIA's post like a knife the sharpest. All hypocrisy, lies, and heartless. They want to stop me, my life make my heart quit. Cause democracy dies in the darkness. Cause democracy dies in the darkness. You kill the messenger. You kill the messenger. Democracy dies in the darkness. Feeling cold now, but got the heater on. Feeling sold out, even though I'm keeping strong. But can I hold out when every bit of freedom's gone? They want me rolled out, never to sing freedom song. I wanna see the sky, I wanna feel the rain. But gotta keep away from windows, that's some window pane. It's just a shame, couldn't have planned out all our dreams. Now I scream, cause there's a man in the machine. But the train is off the tracks, and damn, it's losing steam. I wanna call Christine, I haven't seen since 013. I'm missing life like 3 strikes each night. Seems like 3 nights ain't right. Can't fight, space light, hate life. Wanting to be snake-like, shedding off this gray life. In the dark can't make light, but where I'm headed now is brake lights. Where I'm headed now they break lights. Counting days like brake lights, feeling weight like brake lights. Had a great life, brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Out of place like brake lights, in my face like brake lights. Counting days like brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Sit here asking, what have I done? If these strings were cut, I'd see my son. And if I could just fly from this place, then I'd hold you in my love embrace. And if I could just speak to you now, I'd renew my vow and be in the now. Is this me in denial? Wanna remove stress from your brow and pay you back some way, somehow. But it's painted black, can see the way back now. But how's the house and how's your mom? I doubt the way the media portrays me makes you hate me. But to think you see that daily makes me crazy, that just ain't me.
This is without a doubt going to be this generation's Free Mandela movement. Every single generation must fight again the same battles that previous generations have fought.
Brake lights, counting days like brake lights, brake lights, brake lights, brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Brake lights, brake lights, brake lights.
tumbling underground. I am blinkered, I am blinded. So won't you show me how to let the light in? How to let the light in. Now I know the crazy horses riding on and on through his territories of torture when the nights are deep and long. On a pilgrimage for truth, and under guarded skies of watchful skies, I'm hoping the sunbeams get through. How to let the light in? How to let the light
Feeling cold now, but got the heater on. Feeling sold out, even though I'm keeping strong. But can I hold out when every bit of freedom's gone? They want me rolled out, never to sing freedom song. I wanna see the sky, I wanna feel the rain, but gotta keep away from windows, that's some window pane. It's just a shame, couldn't have planned out all our dreams. Now I scream, cause there's a man in the machine, but the train is off the tracks, and damn, it's losing steam. I wanna call Christine, I haven't seen since 013. I'm missing life like 3 strikes each night. Seems like 3 nights ain't right. Can't fight, space light, hate light, wanting to be snake-like, shedding off this gray life. In the dark can't make light, but where I'm headed now is brake lights. Where I'm headed now they brake lights. Counting days like brake lights, feeling weight like brake lights. Had a great life, brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Out of place like brake lights, in my face like brake lights. Counting days like brake lights, brake lights, brake lights. Sit here asking, what have I done? If these strings were cut, I'd see my son. And if I could just fly from this place, then I'd hold you in my love embrace. And if I could just speak to you now, I'd renew my vow and be in the now.
I'm asking you to make a noise, a big noise, and to keep making a noise until my son is freed. We need to make our protest against this brutality deafening.
I don't want to work for you no more. My hands are cracking, my feet are so sore. I think I better quit before I fall down on the floor. You start accusing me.
do is become WikiLeaks. So yes, we need to go to the embassy. Yes, we need to protest. But what we need to do is become the media, which is exactly what Julian has done. He's not only has he become the media, he's done it so well that he has eclipsed their every achievement to infinity.
Welcome to the 15th Unity for J online vigil for WikiLeaks publisher Julian Assange. I'm Joe Loria, the editor-in-chief of Consortium News. Julian Assange is a wanted man because he's published classified information that reveals crimes and corruption of very powerful people around the world, not just in the U.S., but it is in the U.S. that pretends to be a beacon of freedom and democracy and press freedom that has indicted him, or at least has a criminal complaint against him, not according to a judge in Alexandria, Virginia, But we do know that there is a criminal complaint, and the U.S. wants him extradited to the U.S., to that courtroom in Alexandria, for the crime of publishing. And for that reason, Julian Assange remains a refugee for 6 years now in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. He knows the moment he steps foot onto British territory, he'll be arrested and sent likely to the U.S. without even a extradition hearing as possibility, where he would probably not face a fair trial and could spend much, if not the rest of his life, in prison. Julian Assange is an historic test of press freedom. Though the corporate media, which once profited from him, has now abandoned Julian Assange, they themselves could face the same threat to their freedom to publish, were he to be arrested and charged. Today, we've been running a weekly vigil every Friday. We will have a shortened edition of an hour and a half today. I'm going to quickly read today's headlines and then bring in Brian Becker to discuss them. And after Brian, I will go more in depth in these stories. So I want to welcome Brian Becker to the program. And here are the topics of discussion today. A federal judge, as I just mentioned, Leonie Brinkman is her name, refused on Wednesday to unseal the criminal complaint against Assange. She argued there's no evidence that such a complaint even exists, although we know that the government inadvertently leaked part of what appears to be a criminal complaint in which it clearly says Assange has been charged. Number two on the headlines is WikiLeaks has given the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, which WikiLeaks petitioned previous week, to unseal that criminal complaint and to also to relieve his isolation. This court has given Ecuadorian government 5 days to answer 7 questions on the threats against Assange, asylum after moves to sell Assange to U.S. government for debt relief. WikiLeaks continues to do its work. It dredged up an old document that had leaked of the millions, and that was a coup manual that they call it, in which the U.S. outlines economic warfare it will take against the government it wants to bring down. Of course, the relevance of that is what's going on in Venezuela right now. In addition, new documents were released during this week by WikiLeaks showing that it's continuing to do its work. These are Vatican documents that were given to WikiLeaks and includes a letter by Pope Francis. And this involves a dispute between the Vatican and the Knights of Malta, in which the Vatican essentially has ended the Knights' centuries-old sovereignty. Number 5 in our headlines is Australian diplomats visited Julian Assange in the past few days, and they tell of deteriorating health of the WikiLeaks founder. WikiLeaks points out it has now been over 2 months since The Guardian published its front page intentionally fabricated Manafort Assange story. Its editor, Kath Viner, continues to hide from all press questions on the issue. That's a tweet from WikiLeaks. So let me bring in Brian, because he's got to run along, and I thank you again for joining us.
My pleasure.
Please weigh in on any of that or any other topics you want to make, in particular why, in general, for our audience, why the Assange case is so important. What does it mean, and why should we be doing these vigils for Julian Assange to begin with?
Well, first and foremost, Joe, I want to thank you and the other folks who have helped organize this weekly presence. I think the last question you asked is the most important question. Why does this matter? And why does Julian Assange's case matter? And matter, of course, not only to him and to his family, which it obviously would, but to all of us, all the people who actually believe in justice, who want to tell the truth. It matters most importantly because what Julian Assange and WikiLeaks have done, not once, not twice, not even 20 or 30 or 40 times, but hundreds of times, is revealed documents that are true. Revealed documents and stories, all of which are proved to be true, none of which have been claimed by anyone to be untrue, that reveal that governments that speak in our name are carrying out criminal activity of all types, including, and most notably in the case of the Iraq War, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and most importantly, the crime against peace. The WikiLeaks documentation which all of the media wanted to get. You think about the Iraq war logs, for instance, the journalist from Reuters who was shot dead in cold blood, along with others, including many civilians, including children who were badly wounded by that U.S. Apache helicopter pilot. Reuters wanted to get those documents. They wanted to get that video. They knew that video existed. And matter of fact, they filed public records requests for that video. The video, when one sees it, and I hope everyone has seen it, or if you haven't seen it, take a moment to go look and find it. That video shows that the U.S. government military personnel were engaged in crimes against humanity and war crimes. Now, we know about that because, not because of Reuters, because they were unsuccessful in their FOIA bid, their public records request bid. We know about it because of what WikiLeaks did. WikiLeaks had the guts to publish this. And right now, what the U.S. government is trying to do by demonizing Julian and criminalizing Julian and making it impossible for Julian to have free movement is to try to shut him down and shut WikiLeaks down. And most importantly, to shut anybody down who wants to either be a whistleblower, a truth teller, or to do that which WikiLeaks is also doing, which is to publish materials that the public needs to know. So this is an epic battle. It's a David and Goliath battle, clearly. It matters to us because if they succeed doing this, we the people, we the public, lose this valuable source of information, and other whistleblowers who are contemplating, should they tell the truth? Should they expose criminal activity or fraud or abuse? Should they come forward? Again, it's a chilling message. It's designed to create a monumental headwinds for any potential whistleblower to contemplate that they might suffer the same fate. Arbitrary detention, being holed up, possibly facing, as you put it, many, many years in prison. We should also care because when we see, as we did in the Virginia court case in the last week in Judge Brinkema's court, we've entered this never world, this unbelievable Alice in Wonderland, well, Kafkaesque world whereby the court has a secret grand jury. And the word leaks out that a grand jury exists. And then the Julian Assange and his legal team come in to ask the court to unseal the indictment so that Julian Assange in particular and his legal team can understand the indictment. And the judge says, well, the public's desire to understand what's happening is, quote, premature. Like, what does that mean? That's her words. It's a premature desire to learn the truth about a secret grand jury. So a secret grand jury is in existence, apparently. It inadvertently, through a court filing, is acknowledged to in fact exist. Julian Assange goes into court, and the judge rules, quote, courts cannot perform the delicate balancing required by the First Amendment and common law doctrines under such circumstances. And then by acknowledging if she were to unseal the indictment, she would be revealing that a grand jury in fact does exist, and the government has kept the grand jury secret. So then you must ask yourself, what's the point of having a court? What's the point of having a court if the judges feel so duty-bound to defend the national surveillance state, even as it commits and conducts itself in illegal ways? What's the point of having a court? I mean, it truly is a Kafkaesque nightmare whereby no one is entitled to learn the truth. And if you learn the truth and want it confirmed, your desire to learn the truth is, quote, premature. Because, of course, the secret keepers haven't made it publicly available information, but nor will they. That's the point of a secret grand jury proceeding. I mean, it's really it makes one's head spin. So I think those are some of the issues. There's one other issue that I want to highlight. I'm working, Joe, in the last couple hours and in the last couple days, actually, to launch what will be a national march on Washington, on the White House on Saturday, March 16th. And it has a wide array of organizations and well-known individuals who are coming together to demand, to show actually that the American people don't agree that Donald Trump and Mike Pence and John Bolton and Mike Pompeo have the right to determine who the government is in Venezuela. So we're having a demonstration that says in its main slogan, U.S. hands off Venezuela, no to the coup, no to sanctions, no to a new war. It's very important to link these issues together. The U.S. government has already conducted a soft coup. Well, it's not a soft coup. It was a soft coup at first, and now it's a very hard coup against the formerly democratically elected and non-corrupted government of Dilma Rousseff and the Workers' Party in Brazil. They've carried out regime change operations on Honduras. They're trying to, obviously, and are determined to overthrow the Venezuelan government. And you can see by a combination of covert operations, overt operations, and pressure on countries, say, like Ecuador, that what the United States is basically telling all of the leaders in Latin America is, you do our bidding, you follow us, you stop pretending to be independent, you stop challenging the empire, or we will crush you. And so the U.S. government, in cahoots with elites, have
seem to have lost Brian. Here
sorry,
we go. You're back.
Have I lost you? No.
We lost you for a sec.
They've crushed progressive governments in Brazil and Argentina, and we know now also in Ecuador. They want to snuff out the voices of independence and resistance. And partly, we know that without the change in the government in Ecuador, what's happening right now to Julian would not be happening. So all of these issues are interconnected. The right of people in Latin America to be free, to be self-determining, to be free of economic sanctions and pressure of all types, and also the ability of Latin American countries to unite with and form common cause with other truth tellers, like the former president of Ecuador did with Julian Assange, where under great pressure, he did not relent to the dictates of the empire and gave Julian Assange asylum in the embassy. So, it's all connected. It really is connected. And I want to tell the people who are concerned about Venezuelan freedom, or concerned about the issues of war and peace, or the issues of climate and climate change, or who care about transparency, we shouldn't be fighting along in little silos, independent from each other, as if each issue stands and lives unto itself. We need to draw the connecting dots, and that's why I'm hoping, and we will present Julian's case at this mass march for Venezuela on March 16th, to make the point that standing for freedom in Venezuela also means standing for freedom with all of those who are being targeted by state repression. And that, of course, in this case, first and foremost, means Julian Assange. So anyway, those are some of my thoughts. I was very, you can't help but be upset by the Virginia court ruling this weekend. Again, a truly Kafkaesque nightmare.
Indeed, it is, Brian. She says that the reason she will not accede to the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press request to unseal it is because there's no evidence that it even exists. And there is evidence, of course, that inadvertent filing says clearly Assange has been charged. But that didn't seem to mean much. And her reasons, Brinkham's reasons also is that why the government keeps indictments or criminal complaints sealed is to prevent the accused from avoiding arrest. Well, I mean, Julian's already doing that by staying inside the embassy. He's not going anywhere. So there's no fear of him fleeing. That is and also destroying or tampering with evidence. Well, the evidence is out there. Well, the evidence that of the documents that they get, which classified, have been published. Of course, they know who their sources are, and that's something the government would like to know as well, and will not be revealed by WikiLeaks. So these reasons are absurd. Kafkaesque is the right way to describe that. And as far as Venezuela goes, I just want to add that you won't read in the corporate media about the long history of this type of thing in Latin America by the United States. It's a long old playbook, from creating the nation of Panama out of Colombia to build a canal, to Wilson's invading of Mexico, to certainly all the coups in the 1970s in Latin America, where fascist type dictators like Augusto Pinochet were installed by the U.S. So this is nothing new, unfortunately, but it continues, and it's really great to know that you're putting that march together, because we have to speak out against that. And as I mentioned, WikiLeaks republished this week on Twitter their economic warfare manual that the U.S. uses to bring governments down. So all the information's there, but you're not going to be reading about that in the New York Times, that information, economic warfare, are you, Brian?
No, indeed not. And it's the double speak in all of these is so remarkable. Here you have, like, the U.S. government under Obama. It's not simply Trump, although Trump has taken it to a new level, putting economic sanctions on a country like Venezuela, for instance, as they did in Chile between 70 and 73, as they did in Panama before the invasion of Panama in 1989. You name it, economic sanctions go hand in hand with covert operations and then later military operations. But the U.S. government creates economic pain and suffering of a great type. Henry Kissinger coined the phrase, "We want to make the economy scream." Well, of course, that's people screaming. They're screaming because they don't have food or medicine. They're screaming, and then with the hope being that some parts of the population, like the middle class in particular, that's not used to the same suffering that the poor daily endure no matter what, the middle class will go into the streets and provide the human material for a political opposition that then becomes the human material for the coup d'etat, the final, death and destruction of a targeted entity. And then when the people are screaming and they go into the streets because there's no food or no water or no medicine, or unemployment is skyrocketing, then the same government that imposed the sanctions turns around and says, we are with those poor people in Venezuela or Chile or Guatemala or Panama. We are with them. We feel their pain. And we know that the problem is corruption and mismanagement by the existing targeted government. And you see this all around the world. In the 19th century, and even in the 20th century, colonialists just did what they did. They didn't have to pretend it was for some noble cause. Like, the U.S. Marines and Army were sent to Haiti in 1915, and they just marched right into Port-au-Prince to the main bank, and they took all the gold of the country's gold, took it out of the country, put it on a boat, and sent it to First City National Bank in New York, now Citibank. They just did it, and they did it because they could do it. Now we have the UK, where Julian Assange is holed up. They seized $1.2 billion of Venezuelan gold. But unlike Wilson and the Americans 103 years ago, they don't have to, they can't just take it. They have to say it's for something good. It's for a noble cause. It's for freedom. It's for democracy. We're seizing the gold. But the only difference between imperialism in 1915 and 2019 is the explanations change, but the motivation is pretty much the same. And it's the loot.
Why do you think the explanations change?
Huh? Why
do you think the explanations change? I have an idea. I want to know what you think.
Yeah, I think it's because of the empowerment of human beings in the political process are such. The franchise exists globally. People go to the polls. You can't completely discount the masses of people and their opinions as could be done during the colonial era. So now they have to be sort of massaged or manipulated, or Chomsky puts it, manufactured consent, because unlike 100 or 200 years ago, where the opinions of the masses of people anywhere didn't matter, they do now. So the form of ruling class rule over society has shifted. It's required some sophistication in language. You can't just say, this is going to be the American century, although that's coming back now too, some of the colonial language. So I think I think that's the main reason, because of the empowerment of people. And the colonial slaves of 200 years ago will not accept the idea that they should be colonial slaves ever again. So the appeal to them has to be based on something else.
Yes, I mean, we can absolutely, public opinion became an issue in the First World War when many, many Americans did not want the U.S. to enter that war. So Wilson created the Creel Committee, which was basically a propaganda ministry to sell the war to the American people, out of which the private business public relations industry was born. It was quite successful. So they had to start dealing with the issue of the public's opinion to manipulate and suppress it. But again, during the Vietnam War, maybe for the first time and only time really in U.S. history, there was such a huge public protest that they had to take that into account in the future. So they have to cloak it in this rhetoric, and they also had to change. When Bush invaded the first Gulf War, he said that the Vietnam syndrome was over because they decided that they had to stop that kind of public protest, and the media the government no longer allowed reporters on the ground, as they were in Vietnam, to bring the war home in its bloody gore to the American public. So we had the advent of the embedded reporter. So you're right, all these controls that have to be implemented because they are now a little bit more fearful of the public reaction. And in the developing countries, after the success of various revolutions throughout development countries in Africa, the whole anti-colonial and decolonization of Africa, Cuba, etc., as you just aptly pointed out, those countries do not accept American interference the way they would have accepted what Belgium did in the Congo, for example, in the late 19th century. So we're in an era, and we have to bring in WikiLeaks here because, and this is why they want him so badly. They want Julian Assange because he has revealed in a way that the media has never done before the absolute truth, because those are the documents themselves. This is not journalists being leaked or being told something. We can read the documents for ourselves, so we know how the government operates. We know they use sanctions as economic warfare, as that document they just republished, WikiLeaks just republished, showed. So this is another reason why they've got to fight back and use sophisticated PR and also try to arrest Julian Assange and shut down WikiLeaks, but they can't do it because, as we've just seen, a new tranche of documents came out in the Vatican this week, so WikiLeaks works continue. Brian, if you could stay with us a few more minutes, otherwise I understand if you have to go.
Yeah, let me just, I do have to run, but let me just say, I want to comment on some of your points there, because I think we've gone into an important subject right now. And again, why this actually matters so much. When Bush Sr., George H.W. Bush, ran to the microphone when the war in the first Gulf War ended, February 28th, 1991, his first words were, "The ghosts of Vietnam are behind us," meaning, and he says in his memoirs that and then he went on to say, and he repeats this in his memoirs, that the Vietnam syndrome is over. Now, the Vietnam syndrome was that strange illness that the American people had, whereby they didn't want to support sending their sons and some of their daughters, but mainly their sons, to far-off lands to fight in wars that they didn't understand, wars that were depriving people in the, quote, third world of, their basic rights to determine their own destiny. So the Vietnam syndrome was a thing. I mean, it really was a thing. It became a restraint on the ability of the American government to escalate the war. That's why when Nixon and Kissinger said they had that secret weapon to end the war in '69 when they came in, which was really to drop a nuclear bomb on Vietnam. One, the Vietnamese didn't blink, but also the moratoriums, there's massive mobilizations in the fall of 1980, 1969 made it clear that if they used atomic weapons or if they escalated the war in any appreciable way like that, that there would be a civil war inside the United States. And so that became a restraint on them. So George H.W. Bush was so worried that the Vietnam syndrome would carry over in the early 1990s and be a restraint on the U.S. invasion of Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, but ultimately Iraq. And, that shows that the governments actually do care in this day and age about public opinion. And, I think it was fanciful on their part. They had their fingers crossed. They didn't know if there would be a massive anti-war movement. There was, in fact, a massive anti-war movement at that time, but the war ended so quickly that the anti-war movement petered out. And then the same thing happened in the run-up to the 2003 war. We were having demonstrations literally of hundreds of thousands of people month after month after month. But then once the war was over in 3 weeks, because the Iraqi government it's a small country and it could be overwhelmed, and it was already hobbled by economic sanctions. So the Saddam's army was vanquished in 3 weeks. Sorry, I had a call coming in. Then, so here we are again. Public opinion, the rulers, the powers that be, usually day to day, they have their way because they manipulate and mold public opinion. But, WikiLeaks countered that. Without WikiLeaks, we don't have core information that's necessary to shift the dominant political narrative. Nobody else was doing that, or very few people did it, and not with this level of consistency. WikiLeaks was for real, is for real, and their work is continuing. So, I mean, just think about the past 15 years without WikiLeaks. It would be a different historical era, and that's what they want to do. They want to vanquish WikiLeaks because they don't want this kind of truth-telling to continue to keep going.
Because it could prevent some of their war schemes. Had we had WikiLeaks in 2002, and we'd learned things by leakers and whistleblowers through WikiLeaks about the lead up to the Iraq invasion, maybe it wouldn't have happened. May have turned the public against. Well, as you said, those were the largest demonstrations in history across the entire globe. I was at one in New York, and they were 1 million in London, I think, and Sydney, everywhere. Extraordinary, and it did not stop them. And the Security Council never gave them the resolution they needed either.
That's why they were racing to war, because the public opinion was building so strongly. They had to rush to war, not because Iraq was a preeminent threat, but because the anti-war movement could overwhelm them. So they had to go in, they had to do it quick, they had to get it over with. Joe, I have to take off. I do want to thank you again for hosting week after week on my part and the part of the Answer Coalition as we're doing this work against the coup effort against Venezuela. We are going to continue as we do this to raise the case of WikiLeaks and Julian in particular, and we'll be glad to come back on future online vigils.
Well, thank you, Brian, for being here now, I think 3 weeks in a row, and I really appreciate you stopping by, and it was a short but very interesting conversation with you. Thank you again.
Talk soon.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you to Brian Becker. He's the host of the radio program Loud and Clear. The co-host is John Kiriakou, who's been a frequent guest on these vigils. I just wanted to talk a little bit more about some of those headlines, in particular the extraordinary decision by this judge. Now, I was in the courtroom for the initial hearing, and the government then admitted that they'd made a mistake. But the government says that that's all that they're admitting, that it was a mistake and no one could speculate anything more than that. And of course, the mistake they made was to copy and paste from one criminal complaint into another one. And the one they took from was because apparently the same prosecutors or team were working both on the Assange case and on this totally unrelated case of a criminal case with some guy, nothing to do with WikiLeaks or Julian Assange, but happened to be in the same prosecutor's office. So an apparent innocent mistake was made, where instead of copying and pasting something from Assange's criminal complaint into another part of the Assange complaint. It was put into this other guy's indictment, and when it became public, someone noticed it, and this is why this whole thing happened. And the committee, the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press, is in by no means any kind of radical organization or linked formally in any way to WikiLeaks. They're pretty mainstream, but they just go on the principle of the press needing information from the government. And when you stick to that, you can come up with some pretty good motions. And that's what this group did. They argued that because that indictment, those two paragraphs from the Assange criminal complaint clearly say that Assange has been charged. And here's the quote: "The United States has considered." This is from one of the paragraphs that was mistakenly revealed last fall. Quote: "The United States has considered alternatives less drastic than sealing, including, for example, the possibility of redactions, and has determined that none would suffice to protect this investigation. Another procedure short of sealing will not adequately protect the needs of law enforcement at this time because due to the sophistication of the defendant and the publicity surrounding the case, no other procedure is likely to keep confidential the fact that Assange has been charged." The fact that Assange has been charged, and yet Judge Briekerman says she can't unseal it because there's no evidence to prove that this criminal complaint even exists. That is the essence of Franz Josef Kafka, who we've been referring to. So it doesn't look like we're going to be able to see what the details are of that indictment, even though this Inter-American Court or Commission for Human Rights has demanded answers from the Ecuadorian government on that very question. They don't have binding legal charge over governments in the OAS. It's part of the OAS, so we're unlikely to find that. If you're interested in this Vatican story, I urge you to go to WikiLeaks website and read more about it. It's quite an interesting historical issue where the Knights of Malta, who trace their history all the way back to the Knights who were involved in the Crusades in Jerusalem, they have basically had the sovereignty as a sovereign nation, even in Malta. But the Vatican in this dispute has, in essence, ended it. One of the issues was that the Knights of Malta had promoted distributing contraceptives, which of course the church is against. And this is quite a new development from WikiLeaks. And we need to also, again, stress that The Guardian has not in any way responded to this ridiculous story that they had, which was that Paul Manafort had visited Julian Assange. Now, we have Kathy Vaughan standing by, but before we speak to her and down there in Australia, we have lined up, Joe, if you have it, Joe Booth, an interview that I pre-recorded with Tony Kevin. Tony Kevin is a former Australian ambassador who is speaking out very strongly now in defense of WikiLeaks and Julian Assange. Joe, do we have that ready to go?
Yes, it's standing by.
Okay, we're going to roll that in a few minutes. Kathy, I ask your patience if you can wait till the end of this 20-minute interview. Okay, I just got a thumbs up from Kathy, which is great. So we're going to watch this 20-minute interview with Tony Kevin, and then we could talk about that and other issues with Kathy down there in Australia.
I'm asking you to make a noise.
Joe, let me know when it's rolling,
a big
please.
noise. And to keep making a noise until my son is freed. We need to make our protest against this brutality deafening.
I don't wanna work for you no more. My hands are cracking, my feet are so sore. I think I better quit before I fall down on the floor. You started.
Interview, I think.
We just got the two videos on top of each other. Unfortunately, I just got kicked off the remote and didn't mute the other one.
Oh, let's bring in Kathy as we try to set up the video. Kathy, can you hear me? Kathy Vogan, I think you must.
I can hear you.
How are
Yes.
you doing? Good to see you again.
Yeah, I'm doing pretty well. It's been awfully hot here, close to 40 degrees. So we're all suffering a little bit from heat exhaustion, but now it's cooled right down. So that's cool. Look, I think it would be a good thing if you want me to talk about something immediately.
Yes.
I'd actually like to talk about the most recent article about Julian in the Sydney Morning Herald. I might just screen share that as well. So we're back on air, are we?
Yes, I think so. Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll do that because it's almost good news. So let's just go to Chrome and I'll share my audio. Share. And incidentally, if we have a problem with Tony Kevin's interview, you did pass me a copy to let me see it. We do have Tony Kevin coming to speak live in Sydney. Oh, sorry, not. Yeah, he'll come in live for the Q&A, but we have this event coming up on the 14th of. Let me go to this one first because we are talking about Tony Kevin. So politics in the pub in Sydney. We did on the August 9th last year. We did the gagging of Julian Assange, which was a live to air, and we're back on the 14th of February, live streaming. We've got Caitlin Johnson, fantastic independent journalist and poet. We've got you too, Joe, which is exciting news. We've got Tony Kevin, and we've got James Cogan, who was supposed to be there last time. That one there, the future of Ireland after Brexit, by the way, is being changed to Venezuela in a hurry because our club didn't seem to be ready to do that one, so we had a cancellation. So it was great to give some urgent attention to Venezuela. But this is our live to air on February 14th, Valentine's Day, which is not that far off now, less than 2 weeks. So that's, if anybody's coming locally, that's the Gaelic Club. And if you're wanting to watch live, there is the web address. So I will have it streaming live through the website. So that's all you need to know. Politics in the Pub, all one word, .org.au. And by the way, on our website, we have a link here to donate to the Legal Defence Fund of WikiLeaks, which is always needing a top up because the costs of litigating against defending oneself against the state are just so expensive, as John Kiriakou has pointed out. And it's the whole process, absolutely drains people of their finances. That's been talked about plenty. There's also Christine Assange's interview on our website from 9th of August. And if you look at that, there's also the transcription, the full transcription. So that's pretty good. I'm just going to go back now to the Sydney Morning Herald article. Just bear with me because I've got this little Zoom window that's getting terribly in the way. Right, let's just go back to the Sydney Morning Herald one. That's not the right one, is it? Oh, I'm sorry.
It was revealed by accident or error that the US government is planning on charging him. Can
Goodness
you,
gracious,
A,
I'm
talk about the significance of
things
his
up
case
here.
in terms of press freedoms?
I
And
don't even
B,
know that's
how do you
coming
think the
from.
media and political establishment has
Can
treated him
Joe,
in
can you
comparison
just
to other
I'll
journalists
just stop
that have been
sharing until I get
ill-treated
that Sydney
by the
Morning
Trump
Herald
administration?
thing back up again.
I
And
actually have it here on my screen.
oh, that's a great interview with Glenn Greenwald that I was watching. It just came out last week, but for some reason I can't seem to go back. Oh, here we go. Sorry about that, folks. Okay, so I'll just screen share again. Okay, so this is a very important article here in Australia. And I'd just like to read it to you. So Greg Barnes, who is Julian's legal representative, one of them in Australia, has a lot to say here. We're not getting much information from the state, but Greg has just spoken out, and so he's given a lot of the information. So what we've had happen, and as you announced in the headlines, Australian diplomats have reportedly visited Julian Assange in Ecuador's embassy in London to hear firsthand about what his lawyer says is his deteriorating health. Greg Barnes, an Australian lawyer and advisor to Assange and WikiLeaks, revealed the visit had taken place. He said he and his colleagues will now directly appeal to Foreign Minister Marise Payne to petition the UK government to let Assange leave the embassy for urgent medical care without being arrested. But for now, the WikiLeaks co-founder and publisher will have to consent himself with an offer of continued consular support. Did I just scroll down too much there? This seems to be missing half of the article. Oh, here we go. They have these huge ads. Okay, so the Australian High Commission in London refused to comment on the visit, even to confirm it took place, referring all questions to the Department of Foreign Affairs in Canberra, a clear sign the situation is still a diplomatic quagmire. But Barnes said it was the second such visit. Well, we know about that because the first one was made very public. We had Jennifer Robinson talking about it. She confirmed it just after the Australian diplomats left. And that was probably about 4 or 5 months ago, maybe 6 months ago. Yeah, sorry, it says to read the article. First took place in June last year. He said it was a sign of a more humane approach from the Australian government because I believe this visit was unsolicited. I haven't heard any mention that it was going to happen. So the visit came a day before Assange received the bad news from the US, where a federal judge refused to force the Justice Department to admit the existence of what I believe to be criminal charges laid against him in secret. So this is just a backstory about how long he's been there, Sweden having closed the investigation. However, Britain won't drop the arrest warrant for his failure to show for extradition to Sweden. It's going back a long time, and we wonder why, because the primary case has disappeared. But, you know, it's a hook with which to grab him when he walks out of that embassy. And that's why it's saying he cannot leave. The lawyers are saying he cannot leave the embassy due to the likelihood of being extradited to the US, where they say he would not receive a fair trial. And if you listen to the interview with Christine Assange from August 9th, she fully details the legal context of an asymmetrical extradition arrangement between the UK and the US. So the US really don't have to, they don't have to present a prima facie case to get someone extradited. It's pretty well just, you know, an automatic process where it can happen very, very quickly. I've even heard, I think it was Francis Boyle who may have said that he would, he could be on the plane to the United States within the hour. That's probably that's probably very, very quick. But
I think that was,
you know,
Ray,
without
let me
their,
interrupt a minute. That was Ray McGovern who said that. Although
was
Francis,
it Ray McGovern? Was
yeah,
it?
Francis doesn't exclude that possibility, but he did go through in that interview I had with him what legal options existed, and there could and should be a hearing. So that's possible.
Right.
Not
Yes.
known what would happen.
Okay, I'm very sorry about that.
No,
Yeah, I do remember Francis talking about. So Iran said they welcomed the visit by the High Commission consular officials who were briefed on Assange's medical issues and difficulties. They have seen firsthand the untenable situation Julian is in. His health is deteriorating, yet he cannot get medical care for fear of arrest. It's really barbaric. Oh gosh. We will be asking Senator Payne to seek undertakings from the UK that Assange can leave the embassy for healthcare without being arrested. Barnes said Assange was in one arm and needs dental work. I do believe from John Pilger's speech, he was talking about the letter that Julian's father sent to our Prime Minister. And he said that Julian had a chronic cough for a very long time now, for years. And so he needs an X-ray. That's not something that can be seen from the outside, but I have certainly heard it hundreds of times. Julian does have a terrible cough. So we don't know what's wrong, and that could be something even more serious. But being in chronic pain from one's arm, that's a frozen shoulder to start with, but it's now sounding like it's the arm as well. And I did actually read that can be a symptom of vitamin D deficiency, although I'm sure that measures are being taken to stop his levels of vitamin D going down to critical levels. He is ashen, though. That's something that various people have reported, that his skin was pure white. Which is normal if you haven't seen the sun for going on 7 years now. We're going into the 7th year since the man hasn't seen the light of day, felt the grass under his feet, or the wind, or heard the birds, all those kinds of things that we feel a part of, we take for granted as everyday life. But this man is locked in a room virtually now because his access to various parts of the embassy has been restricted. So you have also this, so it's saying that his health continues to decline. On Wednesday, a US district judge refused a request from WikiLeaks to force the Justice Department to reveal a secret criminal charge against Assange. So yeah, this is the mix-up in Virginia court. And we have the judge, Leonie Brinkema, who's talking about, oh, we can't move really when there's such uncertainty. What a joke. What a joke. Sorry, no, my screen's sharing. Just I got a message to say it was stopped, but that's enough anyway. So I was just thinking that two things. I believe that there still is a second chance, and Joe, you can come in and verify this for me. There is a second chance to have the charges unsealed from the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, because that is one of the requests. And as far as I know, that is that is another attempt, isn't it? Or is it the same one to get the charges unsealed?
It's part of the petition that was filed by WikiLeaks to that Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, part of the American Organization of American States, to end Julian's isolation and to unseal that criminal complaint. But I have to tell you, being a student of American history and politics of the they look upon international organizations as with disdain the moment they do something that Washington doesn't like. We've seen that with the International Court of Justice, which ordered the U.S. to stop mining the harbors of Managua during the civil war in Nicaragua in the 1980s. We see it all the time at the UN, where they don't get the resolution to invade Iraq, they invade Iraq anyway. So they use it as a way to sanction what they're going to do anyway. In fact, inside the Bush administration, just an aside, there were many who didn't even want to go to the UN. I think it was particularly Cheney, but it was Powell who forced them, and they didn't get the resolution, but it was totally immaterial to their aims. So even if this court tells Ecuador that, well, they would have to tell the U.S. to unseal this, U.S. being a member of the OAS. So the court has some jurisdiction over the U.S. They could tell them you must unseal this, and they will be laughed at. I guarantee that. They do not have legally binding or judgments. They could tell them the only thing that the members of the OAS are obliged to do is cooperate. So the U.S. would have to respond to a request, and that response would be no. And they have no enforcement mechanism. Nobody and no international organization has an enforcement mechanism except the Security Council. Even the International Criminal Court doesn't have a police force to arrest. They have to rely on governments to arrest someone who's been indicted as a war criminal at the ICC. So only the UN Security Council could impose sanctions and authorize war, which is what the U.S. wanted in Iraq and didn't get, but didn't stop them. So I don't want to make light too much of what that I think it has a political significance, like a General Assembly resolution, which can embarrass governments, can show the will. So if the court decides to tell the U.S. unseal this, that should be news. It won't be reported. We'll certainly report at Consortium News. We'll discuss it on this vigil. And it shows that an international organization ruled in favor of WikiLeaks. That's significant. But they cannot get it enforced or binding on the U.S. So this is a final decision by Brinkema. We're not going to see that.
Oh, well, I mean, Brinkema seems to be fairly consistent in her judgment. First of all, Kyriakou tells us that she reserves all of the these cases, whistleblowing cases, and now journalism cases for herself. And but it's just the terms of the antiquated, well, now exhumed and like a zombie, alive and kicking like a zombie, the 1917 Espionage Act, whereby, compared to a criminal court, one can say the reasons why one committed a crime, and that could, so if I murdered this person because they were holding a gun at my head, then it could be considered self-defense. But there are no provisions to speak about motivation whatsoever. But I was just going to comment on the uncertainty principle. Just going back to a screen share to take a look at what Judge Brinkema said.
I want to welcome Gareth Porter to our vigil. Gareth, will bring you in a few minutes. We're going over Brinkema's decision to not unseal the criminal complaint against Julian Assange, in which she argued that there's no proof it even exists, when, of course, the government has admitted that. They also admitted it to AP and Washington Post that reported back in November. They had a government source telling both those news organizations that this criminal complaint exists. WikiLeaks retweeted that this week as well. So, Kathy, you want to talk about?
Yes, well, I'm just on my screen share at the moment, looking at Brinkema's own words. the settled rule that the court will not anticipate a question of constitutional law in advance of the necessity of deciding it. Petite versus United States, da-di-da. It requires that the committee's application be dismissed until there is sufficiently certain disclosure that charges have in fact been filed. The committee's common law and First Amendment claims are premature. To hold otherwise would mean that any member of the public or press, by demanding access to judicial records based on little more than speculation, could effectively force the government to admit or deny that charges had been filed. Permitting such fishing expeditions would require courts to sort through endless factual permutations, giving rise to varying degrees of uncertainty. Courts cannot perform the delicate balancing required by the First Amendment and common law doctrines under such uncertain circumstances.
So what does that say, Catherine? She's covering for the government. She's covering for the government that inadvertently told the world that he's been charged. And this is supposed to have an independent judiciary in the United States. It's supposed to be an independent.
Oh, totally. But don't you find this weak and hypocritical? Goodness gracious! Didn't Department of Justice go on a fishing expedition to Ecuador to question 6 Ecuadorian diplomats, except not Fidel Narváez? He refused this kind of intimidation. But all that on the back of a crazy story with absolutely no evidence about Paul Manafort visiting Julian Assange. They're quite willing to move forward when there's that kind of uncertainty. They could say, well, this is an investigation, but, there's absolutely nothing there in terms of evidence. And of course, we have been trying, even Alan Rusbridger is urging Kate Viner to respond. But as I said last week, there's a possibility that, Luke Harding, who was in Ecuador, and the other journalist, forgotten his name. Do you remember it?
You mean the Ecuadorian journalist?
No, not the intelligence agent, not the CIA intermediary.
Getting money from the NED. Yes, she was getting money from the
Yes. So they'd been there for 4 months working with the NED on this story. So they probably had a fair idea in view of the fact that their Ecuador co-author in the print edition, whose name was Villavicencio, Fernando Villavicencio. So his name was removed, but it is well known that he has been an intermediary for the CIA. So there is a good chance that the long-term silence, which it's done a lot of damage to the Guardian's reputation, this one.
Oh, it's interesting you said that about Rusbridger, because I walked up to him after an event at the National Press Club here in Washington. It was short. There's only a few days after this Harding story appeared, and I asked him about this, and he refused to comment. But now you're saying he's coming out and putting pressure on Viner. Let me bring in Gareth Porter now. Gareth, you have anything that you'd like to say about this Brinkema decision or the Guardian story or anything else about WikiLeaks? Why you're here? Why is it important to speak out in defense of WikiLeaks? Unmute your microphone, please. Please unmute your microphone, Gareth Porter.
Can I just let you know, Joe, from the chat window, that when you're ready, you'll be able to play the Tony Kevin interview.
Good. Let's hear from Gareth first, and then we will play Tony Kevin's interview. Gareth, please unmute your mic.
Okay. Sorry,
there you go.
Unmute it. Now I've got it. Thank you.
Okay, now we can hear you. It was nice seeing you, but I want to hear you as well. Okay.
Thank you for welcoming back this stray cat to your group.
Well, I'm glad you got on this time.
Yeah, sorry that last time I found that the link, I just couldn't couldn't get in.
Well, anyway, you're here now,
Yes.
so we're glad you're here.
So I mean, my thoughts have strayed to Roger Stone, of course, and what's going to happen on his case, and how this is going to affect the fate of the efforts on both sides in this issue. You know, the question being, you know, how is the U.S. side, the U.S. government side, going to attempt to show that WikiLeaks equals Russia, and how successful is that going to be, and how much possibility is there that the failure in that regard could help Julian Assange's case?
Well, what do you make of that? I mean,
you know, it seems to me
there was no collusion in that indictment.
Yeah, I know, exactly. I mean, I guess I feel mildly encouraged to believe that there is a very good chance that this will fall flat, to the extent that they seem to be required to show that, in fact, there is a direct, there's an equation here, a meaningful equation between WikiLeaks and the Russian government, that it's not simply a question of WikiLeaks accepting documents that had some connection with the Russian government, or which, you know, could be suspected of being from the Russian government, and that to me is a sign that this case is going to take an interesting turn in the future. But I was interested in your reaction to that situation as well.
Well, I would just quote from WikiLeaks now, a tweet they put out on January 25th, which I guess was the day that we saw that stage-managed over-the-top arrest of Mr. Stone in his Florida house. And WikiLeaks says that the Office of Special Counsel has never spoken with Mr. Assange. It starts by saying that the Dawn military-style arrest of Mr. Stone, a 66-year-old political consultant, was wholly unnecessary and served no purpose other than intimidation. The charges against Mr. Stone do not allege that Mr. Stone lied about his lack of contacts with Julian Assange, but rather about his contacts with others and about documents reflecting those communications. The Office of Special Counsel has never spoken with Mr. Assange. This is a statement that came from Barry Pollock, who is Assange's U.S. lawyer. So, look, this is just another one of these indictments that do not prove any collusion, that names WikiLeaks as Organization One, but never bothered to speak to anyone at WikiLeaks, does not charge WikiLeaks with anything whatsoever, and has no evidence that, again, that Russia even gave these documents to WikiLeaks, and that Mr. Stone apparently was a man who was trying to be in the limelight, was trying to appear to be somehow in collusion, but he wasn't. And you know, it's just but the American public has been conditioned, as you know, Garrett, to accept this indictment as being, another one of the piece of evidence that proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that Russia hacked the DNC and Podesta emails, gave them to WikiLeaks, and WikiLeaks is therefore a Russian agent, and that somehow the Trump campaign was involved in this process. Now, my view is there's only one crime committed in this whole story, aside from these lying to authorities, which I should say as an aside. Colleen Rowley, a well-known FBI official who became a whistleblower after she had tried to warn the FBI about this guy, Moussaoui, I think his name was, who was one of the hijackers on 9/11, that he'd been training in Minnesota, where she lived and where she was an FBI agent, to hijack a plane, to get training, and a lot of red flags to fly came up, and she tried to tell the FBI. And Mueller, by the way, Robert Mueller was the head of the FBI at the time, and
lest we forget,
totally ignored what she had to say. So I've gone off my track here, but the thing is, the only crime that's committed in this thing, beside these lying to the authorities, and what Colleen said last week, to me and a few others in an email was that that charge of lying to the FBI was rarely ever used in the past. It was only used as a leverage against a witness, letting them know if you lie, we could prosecute you, and it would get people more or less to tell the truth. But they never, if they did find that they lied, they wouldn't prosecute in most cases. And this has become a real weapon now in this Mueller investigation.
Right.
In fact, these are the only main charges in most of these cases. But that doesn't register with the public. They did something wrong. He was an associate of Trump, collusion. And the fact is, the only real crime committed here was the stealing of those emails, whether that was done by a hack or by a leak, by a Democratic community insider, downloaded to a thumb drive, as the VIPs. Some of the whips have said and tested this, that a transfer was not possible, or even if it were a hack, that is the only crime that was committed here, not publishing these documents. Although under the Espionage Act, there is a provision where they could go after a publisher for publishing classified information. This is what's so troubling about that act, why it's such an abominable act, but why the governments in the past have been very reluctant, U.S. administrations, to invoke that part of the Espionage Act. They didn't do it against Senator Mike Gravel after the publication of the Pentagon Papers in Beacon Press in Boston. He was no longer under the immunity because he has immunity only as in the middle of a legislative act as a member of the U.S. Congress. They didn't prosecute the New York Times and the Washington Post after publication. They could have. And the Obama administration did not go after Julian Assange and WikiLeaks because of what they call the New York Times problem. Because if they go after him, they have to go after him.
It's fair to say, Joe, isn't it, that has become a firm principle in American jurisprudence, insofar as it reflects an understanding that to use it against those publishers would seriously, essentially destroy the First Amendment. I mean, it would be a big blow to the most fundamental element of the Constitution. And so it seems to me that is a fundamental reality here that we are seeing in play and has been in play for many, many years. So basically, I mean, I guess what I'm wondering is if the politics surrounding Roger Stone and his relationship to WikiLeaks, which is, again, it wasn't direct, but it was through an intermediary. This to the extent that there's any interest in that issue, can only help to at least provide some ammunition for those who are interested in recognizing and getting the truth out. So that's basically the thought that I had. It's not.
Look, Stone had the same interest anybody had about what was coming next from WikiLeaks. And WikiLeaks has pointed out that they got the dates wrong. They didn't know what he was talking about. There was no coordination with Stone. And even if he'd gotten the tip off, that's coming out this date, which didn't happen according to WikiLeaks, and I accept that. So what? That's not a crime if they told him that we're going to, in a week. Julian Assange announced in June on television before that there was stuff on Hillary. So it was public knowledge already. The whole thing is just so flimsy. They had to get him on these process crimes, lying to authorities, obstructing congressional investigation, etc. But that's good enough in the climate that they've created. They've purposely cultivated this mania about this so that those details are not important. A guy from the link to Trump was indicted. That's it. And
politically, you're absolutely right. The climate in this country has never been so totally removed from the real facts surrounding an issue, a central issue in political life, as it is now. And I find this over and over again in any interaction on Twitter with people who are of that persuasion. The only thing that you ever read from these people is, well, it's clear that there has to have been collusion because look at all the number of indictments. That's all you need to know.
Exactly.
It's arithmetic. It's arithmetic.
Quantity of equality.
Quantity.
And they're doing that. They're just piling on. That's right. To create And I think this is a PR operation by Mueller altogether, a political operation, not a legal one, because
Right. Yeah,
charges
it is.
have been so.
But tell me this: am I correct that the forces that are behind Mueller and his investigation, Mueller investigation itself, are counting on being able to somehow convince the world that WikiLeaks is indeed equivalent to Russia, or am I exaggerating the degree to which that has been?
No, people, they're openly saying this. They're saying he's a Kremlin agent, and it's a Kremlin intelligence operation, etc. We've had many officials and mostly horrible careerists in the media who are afraid to go against this stream, repeating that over and over again, saying that this is a new Pearl Harbor. You know, you're a student of the first Cold War, Gareth, and you know that the second Cold War is just like the first Cold War in terms of exaggerating a Russian threat.
Well, you know what, Joe?
Smearing a legitimate critics of the U.S. government policy as Russian stooges.
I think it's worse, Joe. Joe, it's worse. It's worse than the first Cold War. And I'll tell you why. I'll tell you in what way it's worse. And this is important, actually, I think. During the first Cold War, the only people who were suggesting that the elite was penetrated by the communists, that is to say, people like Eisenhower, for example, were working for the communists, were the most extreme radical right-wingers, the John Birch Society. Now, that is the standard political viewpoint of the entire Democratic Party and much of the Republican Party. So, I mean, we are in much worse shape than we were in terms of fundamental understanding of basic facts than we were during the first Cold War. I think it's the most alarming situation that we've ever faced in the United States politically.
Oh, I agree.
Certainly in my lifetime.
Well, when history is repeated, it's a farce, and this is a farce, but it's a dangerous one.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right in saying that it's a majority opinion now. Although McCarthy had the country's attention for all those hearings, he crumbled in the end. I don't know whether this will crumble in the end, and they've learned from that playbook. And the second time around, they're doing it better, I think. But it's the same. The essence is the same of smearing legitimate critics as being Russian stooges and exaggerating Russia's threat to the United States, which is a much weaker country than the Soviet Union was in many ways.
You have, in fact, just touched on a question that is really worth analyzing, it seems to me, in terms of the future of the case with regard to Assange, and that is once the Mueller case is finished, once the investigation is finished, and either they put out their report or they decide there's not going to be a report, whichever is the case, how long then does this mania about collusion continue? Does it in fact begin to crumble as soon as that Mueller case is finished, and they do not really produce the goods that were expected, of course, initially, and are much less likely to be expected now, clearly not going to be happening now? I suspect that whether it crumbles immediately or takes some time, that we will see this fairly rapidly disappear as a cause that the Democratic Party particularly embraces, because it's not going to be worthwhile for them. They're going to find that it's not working for them. And that raises the question whether that will in fact change the political atmosphere in important ways in this country. So I'm just putting that out.
Yeah, that's fine. I think the main intent is to get rid of Trump. So if he loses a 2020 election, that's the end of the Russiagate story. They don't need it anymore.
I think that's right.
If he somehow reelected, and if Mueller comes up with financial crimes that Trump has committed, which is possible, very likely. I mean, nothing to do with Russia. Things back in his past, money laundering, whatever. And that's in the report. And if that could lead to the impeachment hearings. I think they want to get evidence to get an impeachment hearing. They need a crime. They need to get a crime against this guy to impeach him. And so that could happen. And if they did impeach him, that's the end of the Russiagate story. And if he loses the election, it's the end of the Russiagate story. Should he win re-election and there's not an indictment or any crimes, financial crimes, I don't know how, without Mueller's investigation, they can keep this going unless the House, particularly now since the Democrats control it, House Intelligence Committee continues hearings, doing their own investigation. You know, there are multiple investigations here. So they could try to continue to keep this. And as we've seen, they don't need really strong evidence or any evidence at all to get Rachel Maddow and her cohort to go mad on the internet. And, you know, last week she said the cold snap in the United States present an opportunity for Russia to turn off the heat, to kill a lot of Americans. This comes right out of the 1950s. I mean, this is unbelievable. Maybe worse, as you say. Maybe
I think it's worse. But I do think that it is the case. I mean, there's a huge difference between Democrats being able to discuss seriously a case for impeachment based on financial crimes on one hand, and Democrats having some substance or claimed substance from the Mueller investigation with regard to alleged collusion with Russia. That makes the difference between a political atmosphere which is totally toxic in terms of any discussion of issues that relate tangentially or directly to Russia or to WikiLeaks. And so that's a very important distinction.
Well, they have settled in the public mind that Russia stole these emails. You see now all corporate media say the emails stolen by Russia, not allegedly stolen by Russia. They are violating Journalism 101, which any Cub reporter knows. When an indictment is made, that is not a conviction. That is an accusation, a formal accusation, in which evidence doesn't have to even be presented. That could be saved for the courtroom. But this indictment is proof in the minds of the media that Russia stole the emails. So they're not only going after Trump here, they're going after Russia. They want to damage Russia. They want to create tension with Russia for a number of reasons. And this is part of that deal. It fits into a pre-existing drive against Putin's government before the 2016 election, before any of this started.
Absolutely.
With NATO going up to the borders, etc. So just this fits in and gives them more ammunition to paint the Russian government as the greatest evil in the history of the world, one that's threatening the United States, which it is not. In fact, the United States is threatening Russia. So this is going to go on, and they have in their back pocket this GRU agents being indicted, which is really a conviction in their minds. So they could still use that. You know, Russia did this. Now Trump's out of the way, we can relax. But now we have a person in there, a Democrat, who, if they carry forward, this could be even more dangerous, even with Trump out of the way, because they could ramp up that tension with Russia and do everything they can to, worse than stopping détente with Trump, but create enormous tension with nuclear power. Very dangerous. Wherever we head in this situation. And Julian Assange, in the meantime, please jump in. I wanted to bring in Julian, but let's bring in Kathy.
Yes, well, there's a few points that were made there. Just the most recent one. Well, this also ties in with the mission of the Integrity Initiative,
right?
Institute of Statecraft,
absolutely,
baby. Because you know it has been reported that this, and we can see it, that this is essentially a pro-war scenario with all these different clusters, including in the United States, that are all putting out this anti-Russia stuff. And if you look at before Trump was elected, we were already quite worried that Hillary Clinton was going to provoke a situation in Syria that would start a war with Russia. So, you know, it's just he's sort of in the way. He said, wouldn't it be nice if we got on with Russia? But it will be back to business. But I don't know if getting rid of Trump is the main event, because I feel that getting rid of the whistleblowers and getting rid of the journalists who print what they report is much more of the main event. It's the long-term event. And I feel that secrecy, this government secrecy has been weaponized. Just getting back to the situation with the 6 diplomats who are being questioned about Manafort visiting Assange, we will never hear what they said. And I believe that this is nothing more than paranoia inducing intimidation. Julian could worry about that.
You know
what
why?
What have they said? Because they fabricate.
Do you know why we won't hear about what those diplomats said, Kat?
Because it's subject to an investigation that is currently in progress.
Well, that's what they tell you. The BS they'll tell you. No, I think it's because they would cannot confirm that Manafort had visited the embassy. If they did, we'd hear about it.
Of course.
Right?
Oh, possibly. We hear about so many things. There's been so many violations right from day one with Julian in Sweden. The police went to the press. And the story of, this was against their own laws.
In the middle of an investigation, they went to the press.
Yeah,
so that
absolutely.
Investigation is rubbish. Yeah.
I was listening to Edward Snowden for 3 hours last night. And, this is a real problem that the government don't want to have anybody. This is part of why you can't defend yourself as part of the Espionage Act. No questions asked. We have supreme authority, our narratives, and you are not allowed to challenge them. But what is the real problem here? I think that the real problem, and I'm just going to screen share again, because William Binney talked about Executive Order 13526, Section 1.7. So I went and dug that up just to have a look at exactly what it says. So let's share again. So for some reason, my Zoom window is always in front of what I want to read. But here we go. So Executive Order 13526, Section 1.7, it is illegal to classify information that would conceal a crime. Let's read the actual thing. In no case shall information be classified, continue to be maintained as classified, or fail to be declassified in order to conceal violations of law, inefficiency, or administrative error. Ha! We've had some administrative errors, but I mean, of late. Or two, to prevent embarrassment to a person, organization, or agency. And, it was reported not long after Cablegate that, most of it was embarrassment that was caused. So the problem is that, this law, this is President Obama's 2009 executive order, and it is not being observed. That is the problem. This is my article, by the way, that I just wrote yesterday. So if President Obama's 2009 Executive Order 13526, Section 1.7, were actually put into practice, not only would we have less need for organizations like WikiLeaks, the US could leave the 1917 Espionage Act buried in the ground rather than exhuming and adapting it to prosecute whistleblowers, and we shudder to think journalists. But that has to be the next step.
And you make a good point that in a trial, if there were one, in a national security trial, like Julian Assange would face in terms of classified information, he could not use this as a defense, I don't think. Well, he could not use a defense or a political, what his motives were. You cannot, as Dan Ellsberg said on one of these vigils when he got on the stand, he wanted to explain why he leaked Pentagon papers, and he couldn't say that. But perhaps they could bring this forward, that the classified documents that WikiLeaks has published all should not have been classified to begin with, or at least many of them, based on this executive order you just said. They should not have been classified because they were about crimes or embarrassment.
Well, that's the point. That is the point that William Binney and I recall Vivian Kubrick talking about it as well. But that just seems to be ignored. We do have a problem, Houston. We have a problem with crime being committed behind closed doors. So the poor WikiLeaks, organizations like WikiLeaks and Julian Assange and whistleblowers like Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden just feel their civil responsibility to step up and reveal them. That's all they can do, so that we will vote differently. I mean, if that makes any difference. But there has to be a straightening out of this executive order, because, as I say, if there were no crimes, then we wouldn't need martyrs like Julian Assange and Manning and Snowden.
Absolutely. Gareth, you want to add anything?
Well, what I was just thinking was that if that principle that has just been enunciated in the law that was passed or that was promulgated by President Obama, that was just shown on the screen, had been applied in the case of John Kiriakou, surely he would have been declared innocent, or there would be no case, because if there ever was a case that involved clear-cut crime, it would have been John Kiriakou's case, where he was being prosecuted.
And which president prosecuted John Kiriakou?
Obama.
The same one who issued that order.
Exactly. So there you are. I guess we're in a maze here, aren't we?
Well, that's right. I mean, did he really mean it? There's a question that we should ask. He made a lot of promises, Obama, and he went ahead and did quite the opposite. He prosecuted more whistleblowers, charged them with espionage than in all of recorded history. So what's going on there? I mean, it's so confusing.
So this was a hope and change executive order.
Well, I mean, of course, the real explanation for that is the phenomenon that we've seen over and over again in one administration after another, which is no matter which president comes, or which man is elected as president, he inevitably is confronted with a phalanx of powerful bureaucracies, national security bureaucracies, who are determined to get their way and who, generally speaking, do get their way, although there are rare exceptions to that principle, to that generalization. That is indeed, what happens with regard to a series of decisions having to do with wars. And of course, it does happen with regard to issues of whistleblowers, for sure.
Yeah, I've got one more screenshot that just came through from our elves, our fact-checking elves in the background. I'd just like to show you. This is a joke. This is a joke. You're going to laugh. Okay, here we go. Where's my Chrome? Here we go. Share. Okay, so apparently it is legal to lie to Congress. False Statements Accountability Act, FSAA, was sponsored by one-term freshman Senator William Martini, who later became a federal judge. It included a bizarre subsection that permits judges, attorneys, and parties to lie to Congress, to courts, and agencies without liability. There you go.
Wait a minute, that's a bill or that's a law? Give us some more details about that, please, Cass.
Was it actually passed?
Yes.
Wow.
Well, it's saying, Tyler, let me screen share again. Sorry. I'll just go back so everybody can look at it as well. As I say, this just was shot through to me very quickly, just very shortly, sorry, before I mentioned it. So I must admit I haven't read it yet.
Well, let's read
here
it.
we have.
Yeah. Tyler and Douglas.
Let's look just above that at Ninth Circuit Judge Susan P. Graber.
Is a congressional, legislative designation rather than a law.
Yeah.
A law. right? I mean, that doesn't suggest that it was already passed. I don't know.
Yeah, well, it does say here, learn about the 1996 law they passed while you were asleep to make sure that no one goes to jail.
So
but that requires further looking into, which I will do.
well, if this ever became law, then you could lie and not go to jail, and in Julian Assange's cases, you could tell the truth and go to jail.
Well, that's the same for everybody, isn't it? This is the great problem. How do we, the public, ever get the truth? I was saying one of my memes that if it is illegal to classify information that reveals that conceals crimes, but it is also illegal to publish information that reveals them. Crime wins in the end, doesn't it? I mean, that's why we're in such a terrible state of not knowing what the hell's going on, and things just being done by people who benefit from secrecy and impunity. And it's happening here in Australia as well, in particular with respect to refugees. And Julian is a refugee. It's appalling.
Well,
I think he's just such a soft target. Go ahead, Gareth.
I think Joe was just going to say something. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say they have all their bases covered there. So when they want you to lie and get away with it, you can, and when you tell the truth, you can't. So.
Well, Joe, this goes to the what is the fundamental trend in world politics and government? Is it in fact that the world is being overtaken by authoritarianism of the right sponsored by Russia, or is it the case that the world's politics are being overtaken by the increase in executive power that comes from centrist governments, basically, and who have been ruling the roost for decades now? That would be an interesting subject for discussion. But
that is those are the centrist extremists, as Tariq Ali.
Exactly.
That's a form of extremism as well, centrism.
Right.
Well, I think also this is this takeover is also there's a part played by the intelligence agencies and compliant media. So particularly against WikiLeaks and Julian Assange in particular, all kinds of spin. He's been vilified so that because the only ones who can really defend him are all of us, because we need the truth. The world needs the truth, and it will have it eventually. And that's that's just no matter whether you're an intelligence agent as or whatever, or a politician even, or somebody working in a corporation, you can be an ethical person and say, well, I'm just not going to take this anymore. I think people should know about this. I mean, this kind of secrecy, Daniel Ellsberg talked about why people don't blow the whistle. There's all kinds of complex reasons. In fact, there is a really great book written about that called Crimes of Obedience. Kelman and Heller, I believe,
it's 18 hours.
Are the authors. But one of the reasons is solidarity with their gang. It's not, even when there's no impunity, if you look at the egregious crimes that were being committed by the church, if you look at the tobacco industry, where people working there knew for 50 years that tobacco was carcinogenic, and it took Merrill Williams, to come along, a lawyer, accountant, sorry, who decided to just put all of that out there because it was good for humanity. What WikiLeaks does, what Julian does, is good for humanity in the long term. And we just being keep being told that he's a rapist, that he's a Trump supporter, that WikiLeaks are partisan. You have Hillary Clinton being allowed to get away with it on the ABC television in Australia, saying, why doesn't WikiLeaks ever release anything about Russia? But that's crazy stuff. The craziest stuff is that she wasn't challenged, because WikiLeaks have released over 800,000 documents about Russia. And when Clinton said that, it was only 3 or 4 weeks since the Russia spy files had come out. And don't tell me she didn't know about it. So, journalists have to step up and stand together to back up, the truth, and to not let and hold these people to account when they start spinning all of their narratives to turn our support away from the only organization that we can really rely on 100% for the truth about what's happening in this world, and the founder of that organization. We have to stop believing all of this spin that is being put out by the executive, of course, but not quite the executive, because it's Hillary Clinton, but also the intelligence agencies as well, and then the media that relay it, that are really designed to demoralize Julian. Everything, all this weaponized secrecy is to demoralize and break him. And we, the people, have to stand by WikiLeaks and Julian in order to get what we need moving forward into the 21st century.
Well said. Thank you.
Bravo. That's why we're here, Kathy, to try to.
Just a stray thought after hearing the last few minutes of discussion. I wonder if it would be helpful, or if it's even feasible, to have a mechanism, an organization, I'm thinking aloud here for the first time, that measures the degree to which dissent has been reduced over time, over a fairly long period of time. Is there any way to measure that could be quantified or shown in some fashion in a dramatic way? Because it seems to me that is a crying need to demonstrate or to document the reality that dissent from the official or semi-official set of narratives surrounding politics and international politics in particular, how much that has been narrowed over the years. And I look back, I'm old enough to remember the Vietnam War era, when I was a young would-be academic, and I was able to be published. I was able to get a kind of dissenting views in the New York Times op-ed page during the Vietnam War, which challenged fundamentally one of the major rationales for the war, from put out by Nixon, the Nixon administration, and that simply is unimaginable now. And so I'm just wondering if there's some way to quantify, illustrate, dramatize what has happened over the decades and how it's happened.
Well, I think there is a mechanism already that we could point to what's happened in the last year or so. And that would be the Google rankings of dissident websites that have been purposely deranked by Google on behalf of the government as a proxy. The government, of course, cannot impose censorship in terms of prior restraint on publications, but they can get their buddies in the private sector to do it who are not restrained by those laws. And we've had the head of Alphabet, whatever the name of the new parent company for Google is, testifying over a year and a half ago, saying that we're deranking RT and Sputnik stories. Speaking of Sputnik, I see Mr. Lee Stranahan here joining us. And therefore, we could see, and many websites, dissident websites, have complained that they do not come up in Google searches like they used to before. But I also wanted to make a comment in regard to what you said about why back in the 60s you could write such an op-ed in the New York Times. You just point to Professor Stephen Cohen, I think the best expert we have in the U.S. on Russia. And Cohen makes this point repeatedly that in the first Cold War, like we were talking about before, Garrett, the first and second Cold Wars, there was a real debate in the United States.
Yes.
Policymakers, academics, journalists, and the public about whether there should be or not détente with the Soviet Union. It was a debate. We don't have that debate now, he points out. We don't even have that debate about the values of détente with Russia now. Still a nuclear power, more advanced nuclear weapons on both sides. And we don't have that debate. So that's another indication of a lack of dissent, even in official, academic government circles where they would used to be able to debate that.
Good points. And
Joe, I wouldn't even.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead,
Joe,
Cass.
I wouldn't call it dissent. I think, or at least I think that needs to be unpacked. Because if you look at the kind of websites that are being bumped down by the algorithms, it's not because they're left or right. I mean, you've got on either side, you've got the ones that are loyal to that side of politics. The ones that are being targeted are the true investigative journalists, the ones that are actually digging deep. Is that true? These are people that go down the rabbit holes of the internet to find evidence of whether and can actually refute what we call scientific journalism. That's what's being targeted, because that is what successfully refutes the narrative.
And who's the number one journalist doing that? He's sitting in
WikiLeaks.
He's sitting in an embassy in London right now, and unable to go out and take a walk.
Yes, but you've had this happen to the World Socialist website with some very good investigative journalists there. James Cogan is one of them, and he's going to be talking in Sydney. You've got Truth Out. You've got other ones as well that just the cream of investigative journalism. That's the threat. It's not a question. People say, the World Socialist website made objections that it was left-wing websites. I believe that it's nothing to do with whether they're left or right. It's whether they're just right. Are they right? Do they have the evidence to prove that that narratives are wrong?
That is absolutely correct, Kathy, except you left out one website when you
What's that, Joe?
I don't know. I have one in mind, but let me bring Lee. While you're thinking, Kathy.
I'm so sorry.
What's the name of that one again?
Near the top of the pile is consortium news.
Oh yeah, that's the one.
Oh, baby, I'm so sorry.
Let me bring Lee Stranahan. Are you able to speak to us, Lee? Are you unmuted? Please unmute your microphone before you join us. He's not ready to join us.
No,
yes, he is.
Did that get me on?
You're on.
Hey, Joe, how you doing?
You're on the air. It's something you rarely do. So Lee is a host with Garland Nixon of the morning show on Sputnik Radio. I've been guest on their show. It's an excellent show. Takes on a lot of topics. And you've been listening to the discussion. Lee, you must have a few things to add.
I sure do, and I just want to say hi to everybody. And I apologize for not having been here for a few weeks. And I just had I've actually my schedule's just been crazy. But yeah, so let me just take a few things. I think if you look at this historically from the future perspective, when you look back on this time, right, what's happened is we've had the biggest revolution technologically in the history of human civilization in about the past 10 years. And it's basically everybody now has access to research and the communications means like we're using now. Everybody walks around with a camera, with a TV truck in their pocket, right? And this has completely freaked out the power establishment because, and you can see this with any number of things, but the amount of, just think historically throughout all of human existence, how long it took for the average person, the person living on a farm in the country somewhere, which was most people, right, to figure out scandals. It would take months or years or maybe never, right? Then it got quicker with the advent of radio and TV. And the past 10 years, boom, everything's different. Now anybody can get on and talk and broadcast to basically the world, right? And who the person who's most emblematic of that, of course, is Assange. Assange is where journalism and that technological revolution meet. And so what's happened is the power establishment, who for a long time, I used this example in the radio this morning. Let's take somebody at the center. By the way, I think a lot of what's going on with Assange is very simple to understand. Julian Assange is the person who could put a lot of this stuff in the Mueller investigation to rest right a year ago. A year ago, he has offered to talk in exchange for not being unfairly prosecuted, basically, right? But that's what's going on. Right now, the reason Assange is under a shutdown is, for instance, we just had Roger Stone indicted. Now, and the whole question is, was Roger Stone communicating directly with Assange? Well, Assange could certainly answer questions about that, except he can't answer questions about it. And by the way, I'll also note, you talk about the technological shutdown, you can't even read Roger Stone's Twitter account. This is one of the things I've said about these Twitter shutdowns. The most frightening thing about them to me as a journalist, if you want to shut down someone's account, that's fine in a sense. I'm opposed to it. But let me tell you, as a journalist, Joe, you know this, deleting the account so that I can't, as a journalist, research what someone said is a shocking affront to journalism, because it makes research impossible, basically. I'm looking for an archive of Roger Stone's Twitter feed. I can't find it, right? And the reason I'm looking for it is because I do research, right? I want to see the context he said certain things in. Can't do it, right? And so what you have happening here, in a sense, to me, with Assange, of course, it relates to other issues. But the big issue right now in the U.S. for the last 2 years has been this Trump-Russia accusations, and we can't answer them. So they've done so many things to make it almost impossible for you to figure out what's actually going on, from shutting Assange up to deleting Twitter accounts of key people in this, to having, as you say, a press. There's not just no debate. I'll give you a key example. Have you seen any serious analysis in the press of any of these Mueller indictments? You don't see any. There's nobody going, well, he didn't really prove that point. In fact, what the media does is, as soon as an indictment comes out, he indicted 12 Russians over the summer when I was at Helsinki. The media just goes, well, it's been proven that the Russians. No, it hasn't. I mean, by no standard has it been proven. It's not in the indictment. It hasn't been in the court of law. It's not been proven. But they repeat the same lies over and over again. What's happened is the power elite, I don't know how else to put it, but basically rich and powerful people, from kings, presidents to generals, they know what's going on with technology. They see where it's going. They're desperately worried that you, whoever you are, you, a citizen, will be able to figure out what's going on and get past their lies in almost real time. And that's why we have these populist revolutions going out across the world. They're not left or right, as Kathy was saying. They're both. They're kind of neither. The Yellow Vest movement, it's kind of its own thing. The Italy thing was kind of weird. Even right now, even I would argue Trump and Obama, actually, I would argue both of them were people in the U.S. going, you know what? I don't trust the Bushes. I don't trust the Clintons. This guy seems new and different. Maybe I'll give this a shot. That's my option. I'll give this a shot. He seems outside like that establishment. They don't turn out to be. They turn out to be, but I don't blame them. I blame the system. We've got a system that's been going on for at least hundreds of years, going back to Cecil Rhodes and stuff like that, trying to keep empire in place, okay? And I think we're just seeing it play out now. And I think we're seeing the good news is, I think we're seeing we've seen it, it's over. The establishment doesn't control our ability to research and communicate fully yet. They're trying, but I think they realize it's a losing battle and they're just kind of freaking out. So that's one of my takes on it.
Well, I have to respond to you about you saying that they're frightened by us having these portable devices that we could bring around with us that are a library and a TV studio, as you said, or a TV truck. But they've responded to that right from the start, because these are portable surveillance devices that we're carrying around with us. They, you know,
one could imagine as well that they have been stalling for years, you know, with the British Crown Prosecution Service telling Sweden, Prosecutor Marianne Nye, no, don't stop it. Sweden wanted to close the case in 2013. No, don't close it and don't come to London. We had Justice Stefan Lindskog, who's Chief Justice of Sweden, come to Australia, and in the Q&A, he had his speech prepared, which was all about sex. It was lurid, but condoms and things like that. But the thing is, in the Q&A, it actually came out, it slipped out that there was absolutely no legal reason. We have stories, such as the Manafort story, whipped up by Luke Harding, always to give the impression that something is going on. We have Assange being gagged because he's the one they fear the most. He's the best, as you say. He's at the top of the pile of investigative journalists because he's figured out a wonderful method that people, ethical people, wherever they are, even in government, even in the intelligence agencies, and people, great people have stepped up, may leak in secrecy. WikiLeaks have got 100% record of never blowing a source, which even the Intercept can't claim pride to. And I feel that they are panicking. I think you're right, Lee. It's the biggest change that we've had, possibly since the printing press. But of course, radio and television did accelerate our ability to find things out, but it's a whole different ball game now. Andy Warhol once said that one day everyone will have their 15 minutes of fame. He couldn't have imagined what would have happened, because that's us. We can publish, all of us.
Well, Joe, I'm sorry, Kat. I'm just saying Joe's point's well taken, though, because the problem is, of course, I don't want to seem like a Pollyanna on technology. I'm not. I love technology, but it's fraught with danger. And when I had dinner with George Galloway a few months ago in London, and I told him something. I can't remember the source, but he quite liked it. Where I read somebody who'd said the future. There's two dystopian views of the future. The one everyone talks about is Orwell's 1984. He said, but I forget who said this, so credit to whoever said it. But he said, the world we live in is actually Brave New World. The world we live in is not 1984. And so this creates, and I think when people talk about 1984 and you look around, you go, well, this isn't exactly 1984. Sure, there's screens with CNN lying to you 24/7 everywhere, but okay, that's maybe a little Children of Men, but okay. But Brave New World hit it, which is that we live in a consumer dictatorship. And so the left's component is the left has the left doesn't trust, I'm speaking just broadly and dumbly, right? But the left doesn't trust corporations and they put a little more faith in the government. The right doesn't trust the government and they put a little more faith in corporations, right? Just in the broadest possible stupid sense, right? So what's happening is they're both right. They're both absolutely right. And people on the right, Trump supporters, absolutely know that they don't trust corporations and everything else. And people on the left aren't like into a police state. The people I'm seeing, especially the people you mentioned, who are getting shut down, right? That's what's happening. And so I think that's one of the reasons for the split is that we live in a consumer dystopian nightmare. We live in a dystopian nightmare where you can go get a 50-inch TV for $300 at Best Buy. And I can't think of a better drug deal than that. That is the best. right? And it keeps you occupied all day, and it's got Netflix and everything else built in, and that's the world we live in.
Well, you could also watch the Julian Assange vigils on that TV.
That's right, and see that's why they're frightened, because they know that we in fact do still have a First Amendment. We in fact do have courts that kind of sort of occasionally work, but not mostly, but kind of sort of occasionally work. So they can't do that kind of shutdown. So they have to do what they've done, which is accuse everyone on this telecast of being a conspiracy theorist, accuse everyone of being pro-Putin, everything. It is all a way of getting full spectrum dominance, mind control. And by the way, they do it on the right as well. And I'm on the right. They do it on the right as well. And I think it's high time for everybody on the left and right to realize how they've been snookered by their own. It's not just, I say this all the time on the show, and Garland, my co-host on the show, who is, by the way, I just got to say this, a rat bastard, because here's why. It is snowing in DC. It is frozen across the country, and he is on a plane right now to Hawaii to cover Tulsi Gabbard's announcement, which, by the way, I hate him because it's a completely valid story and a good use of journalistic resources. But Hawaii, right? But anyway, Garland is very, very good. Garland is very critical of the left, and I'm very critical of the right. And from a sort of loyal opposition standpoint, right? But I see how people get lied to by Fox every day, and I talk about it every day. And Garland sees how people get lied to by MSNBC. Rachel Maddow had a story the other night that the Russians could take out the power grid and make all the gas lines to Sioux Falls go poof. Right. That was literally a Rachel Maddow story. So this is fear. It's just fear mongering. But again, the bright side is I do see people waking up to it. Now, they don't have a mechanism yet, but.
Speaking of mechanisms, can I ask a question, Lee?
Sure, of course.
What is to keep people in the sphere that is neither, right nor left in the traditional sense, but independent-minded from doing something to replicate the functions of Google, Twitter, Facebook, without the corporate control? Has anybody been looking into this? What do you know about the prospects for constructing an alternative to these institutions, to these corporate institutions?
Oh, you've asked me a question that I will talk about in some detail.
Okay.
So the obvious future solution is distributed and not a centralized network. If you think about what Facebook and Twitter are, they're really a new thing in the internet. If you go back to the, let's say, 90s internet, right? The goal there was everybody would have a home page. Remember that? Remember the old days? We talked about like home pages and websites, and you'd have your own, and then I could have my home page and I could go to yours and see what's going on. What Facebook and Twitter created was a public square, but people didn't look closely and notice the public square had cameras and machine guns up around the corners. Does that make sense? The solution is this blockchain thing, without getting to the tech details, that allows a non-centralized distribution. And I've said this before, the problem that Jack from Twitter has, I'm empathetic in the following sense. He's trying to regulate speech for a platform that's got 8 zillion people on it, including kids, including whatever, people of all different religions and beliefs and everything else. And there is bullying that goes on, and beyond bullying that goes on Twitter. That being said, the problem is when you're trying to regulate speech in a public square that holds that many people, it's inherently not possible. It's never going to be possible. It's never going to make sense. So the solution, I think, what we're going to see coming is more of these distributed, where I I control I had my whole YouTube account deleted, 10 years of work, including lots of journalism, including reports that I did from Beirut, all gone. No appeal, no getting my videos back. They're gone. Every video I shot in Lebanon, where I was covering the Syrian, the start of the Syrian refugee crisis in 2013, all gone. Every one of them gone. And interviews that I did, all kinds of stuff. And the problem was, it used to be even storage right now. I don't know if you priced a hard drive lately. You know, a gigabyte is like $40 or, you know, forgive me, a terabyte. A terabyte is like $40. I go back to the Radio Shack TRS-80 with a cassette drive. That was my first computer. So a terabyte for $40 is crazy. But the fact is that anybody can own a terabyte of storage now. That was not even possible 5 years ago, something like that, 5 years ago. It was just prohibitively expensive. Now it's nothing. And so as the technology and storage and that gets better, so the whole trick is going to be, is the government going to try to regulate it and say that one of the interesting things that's happened in the Trump administration that I've noticed that I haven't heard a lot of people talk about is the way that they've used sex trafficking. And I see this a lot in the media. They use sex trafficking, which let's be very clear. Sex trafficking is bad, blah, blah, blah. That's all, yes. Everything you can say about sex trafficking is bad. But they've used it, for instance, to ban websites of prostitutes who aren't being sex trafficked. In other words, there are women, in fact, there are women and men who make a choice as adults on their own to have sex for money. And those websites are illegal. You can't do them anymore. They passed it, and nobody objected because no one wants to be like I'm pro-sex trafficking. Of course, I'm not pro-sex trafficking, but I thought that was a very scary development. And part of the reason it's a very scary development is because the way they did it. They pitched it as a sex trafficking thing. So the way they'll do this is, well, we need to stop child pornography, again, a bad thing. We need to stop sex trafficking, again, bad. But they'll say it's what they've done with the drug war. It's what they've done with everything else. They'll use it as an excuse to curtail people's freedom. But we'll see how it turns. The problem is no one knows where it's going to go.
Let me jump in here and just quote two people that makes a point about what we've been discussing. One was Tom Drake, who is, of course, the NSA whistleblower. And he told me once that, we're now living in a world where they have less secrecy and we have less privacy. So this is what's happened. The government secrets are being bared, but our privacy is going down the tubes. And then there's Julian Assange himself, who made this remark in, I don't know the date, but in a speech, he said, that brings me to the privatization of censorship, in where the field of public discourse is on private land. You were talking about Twitter and Facebook, holding that, and archives that are historically important to all of us and become our intellectual records are no longer something that is safe, no longer something that we can build our discourse on and indeed build our civilization on, because they are being ripped out from under us at the very moment we're trying to cite them. I think that's very appropriate to what you were just saying, Lee. And I want to add this about whether we're living in in 1984 or Brave New World. I think both are true, obviously, the consumer society and the surveillance. But there's another one, another futuristic book, a frightening one, written in 1953 by Ray Bradbury, Fahrenheit 451. That came to mind twice. Once there's a scene at the end of the book where Montag, the fireman, was discovered hiding books in his home, which he's supposed to be burning. And the police are chasing him in helicopters. And as he's running in the fields, it's being broadcast live to everyone on TV. This is 1953. When I saw that white Bronco going down the road in LA in 1994, I immediately thought of that had come true. That when O.J. Simpson was fleeing down that highway in his white Bronco, the networks had, CNN in particular, I think, had a helicopter with a live shot of that chase. It's become an important chase. And then I thought of that when Roger Stone was arrested, because CNN was clearly allowed to be there. Whether they were tipped off or not is not clear. To me, it looks like they were. But even if they figured it out themselves, the FBI could put a yellow tape way around down the street and keep the media away if they want. That was part of why this is a political prosecution, because this is a public relations operation by Mueller. It's to get the public to continue to believe there's this collusion, and that here the public was brought in live on TV to see this arrest. And that reminded me of Fahrenheit 451. So those are three books.
I've been pretty vocal on this because again, people may not know this, but I'm the one who actually involved Roger Stone in this whole mess in the first place, because I ghost wrote a piece for him at Breitbart that was my idea. I came up with it. And if you look at my exchanges with Guccifer 2, whoever Guccifer 2 is, I don't know who it is, but I said, I'm the one who wrote that piece for Roger, and he didn't know anything about this. When I called Roger Stone and pitched him the idea of me writing a piece under his name, he didn't request to me. See, I had the idea to do it because I was talking to technical experts. This is why one of the reasons I work for Sputnik. I've never believed the Russia story, never. So why would I not work for Russia? I've never believed it. And I never believed it because I was talking to tech people who weren't Trump fans at all, who were saying, this doesn't make sense. Here's the malware they used. Why would the FSB use blah, blah, blah? And they were just all these technical things. Then I read the JAR report and everything else. It didn't make any sense to me. So I could see the Democrats at the time, Donna Brazile, Hillary Clinton, W. Wasserman Schultz, immediately pulling the Russia thing. And when I looked into it, I'm like, I'm open to the idea, but it's not true. So it's not that I don't think Russia wouldn't do, it's just that I didn't think they did do it. So, governments do things, so I get that. But I'm the one who got Roger Stone into this because I called Roger and said, can I write a piece? If I write it under my name, Breitbart, it will be up for 1 hour and it'll get 10 comments. If Roger Stone writes it, it'll get like 5,000 comments or something. And I said, now, Roger, I know you don't like controversy or public spotlight, so you might not want to get it. And, he laughed. and I'll tell, by the way, I will say this as a writer, and anybody who writes, think about this. It's fun to pretend to be Roger Stone when you write, because as an investigative journalist, I don't throw bombs, right? I lay out facts. But as Roger, I get to make some quips. You know what I mean? So I wrote some Roger Stone lines, And anyway, we went back and forth. He approved it. But I was coming into my job 6:30 in the morning, getting ready to host a radio show. It suddenly is breaking that Rogers was raided. To your point, Joe, you don't do that kind of big operation, helicopters and boats and everything. The reason, it's theatrical. The boats added production value, as we say in Hollywood, right? The whole thing, the fact that the camera's there when they're about to go in the door, that is drama. It's exactly what you say. And like I say, I mean, that's the world. That is the world we live in right now. You talk about the Bradbury reference for Fahrenheit 451. Absolutely the world we live in. And of course, that was way before the first, I don't know if people remember this, but I interviewed one of the people who was there. The first time live TV went out was in the 70s, was the SLA shootout, where they surrounded the Symbionese Liberation Army House. Remember that?
Yeah,
I don't. But
as I remember,
that was the first time that was the first live, like, breaking news kind of thing. So you're right. That was 20 something years late after Bradbury wrote it. Yeah. Let me also say one other thing, Joe, just real quickly. Although I love technology, I got to say, I can't be the only one who's jealous of that phone behind you.
That is high tech, man.
Am I right? That's an awesome
typewriter. The typewriter.
And a typewriter.
The typewriter is a little modern. I'll be honest. The typewriter looks a little modern. But not quite Hemingway. But that phone, that's quite something.
I bought that in Romania like 10, 15 years ago.
That's a
If
Romanian
anybody
cell phone right
wonders-
now.
If anybody wonders, I will admit right here in front of everyone that it does not work and it's a prop. As the typewriter does work, but that's how I produce Consortium News on that manual typewriter, which is why, Garrett, it takes so long to edit your stories. I'm sorry. I'll let you know that. We are about to wrap up our show, and we're going to do that with the pre-recorded interview that I had with Tony Kevin from Ambassador. But I'll give everybody here a last word. I want to thank, first of all, Brian Becker, Kathy Vogan, Gareth Porter, Lee Stranahan. But Kathy, Lee, and Gareth, if you want to have a final word, and that'll give a chance for Joe Booth to set up that interview, which will end the program.
I certainly do. I certainly do. I've been listening again to jump in. Just going back to the disappearing records and Julian's comments. I can't see. Oh, here we go. I just want to go back to that screenshot because we didn't have it up before.
No, we didn't.
Julian, in his own words, I think what's really clear here is that Julian's struggle and his concerns and my concerns as well, and the purpose of WikiLeaks. The struggle is for the integrity in the historical record. Maybe we've never had so much truth-telling, but maybe we've never had so much lying as well. And all these measures that are taking away civil liberties in order to curb this truth-telling, the deletion of Lee's films, the deletion of information that governments don't want to exist. It was never theirs to leak in the first place. It was somebody else's information. But, you know, I think that the struggle of WikiLeaks and Julian is an epistemological study. Epistemology, the study of theory of knowledge. And what we're seeing, I'm researching a piece I'm going to write about this, but what we're seeing is epistemic injustice being perpetuated against Julian. Now, what is that? There's been a lot of feminist literature on the subject of epistemic injustice. Well, that's where somebody's free speech is subtly denied by discrediting them. And then there's another kind of epistemological injustice, and that's called hermeneutic injustice. And that's where people can't even conceptualize that they have a problem, right? I think what we all have to realize and get out of our heads this idea that, you know, WikiLeaks are partisan and Julian is a Trump fan and all that kind of thing, is to realize what the struggle is. I think that our historical record is in crisis. And if we're not careful, it's going to be a real schmozzle going for it. It already is, with so much crap that nobody believes. But once again, I think that all these things are being put out, like the Manafort visits, as a panic reaction, telling Marianne Nye not to come, a stalling reaction until they try to figure out how they can fully take control over the historical record. Whether it is true or not doesn't matter. It's really about this grab for the historical record, and the attack on Julian is political. But what we stand to lose is our sense of self, is our sense of reality of what is going on in the world, and we desperately need to have that with us moving forward. So if I might just do
Thank
this
you very
final
much. Oh, okay.
little plug. What everybody has to do ASAP is defend WikiLeaks. You can donate. You can challenge false reporting in the media. That's what we're doing here. That's what investigative journalists do. You know, let's play whack-a-mole with it. You know, if one gets knocked down, let another one pop up. There are many good mentors now. Write to your political representatives, write to a human rights organization and union, sign petitions and letters, and join campaigns, and keep yourself informed. So as some of those shadow banned websites that are could be left or right, but are doing great investigative journalism have been mentioned today. Seek them out. They haven't disappeared. They're just a little bit harder to find for people who have not found them already. And support WikiLeaks like never before, because you stand to lose if you don't.
Thank you, Kathy. And watch these vigils. Gareth, final words from you.
Well, I just want to thank you all for a very bracing, stimulating conversation. I learned a lot, I thought a lot, and I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for letting me be part of it.
Okay, Lee, you've got about 3 minutes. Then we're going to run the video. Joe, get it ready. Thanks.
Okay, I'm pretty good at the timing thing. So yeah, let me just say, first off, I thought Kathy's comments were great and very, very important. She's right. This isn't an epistemological problem. And the two areas that she brought about, the discrediting and also people being unable to conceive of the situation we're in, really kind of sum up the tools that are being used by the establishment. And on the other hand, the problem, which is right now, people literally are unable to think. Most people, they can see it, but political discourse is presented in terms of these left-right team sport things that, and you know, there are no socialist or laissez-faire capitalists at Davos. That's what I'll say. At Davos, it's all kind of a mix, right? It's whatever they need to be. The establishment has learned that if it's to their, and companies, and they've learned, if it's to their advantage to go into a country and strip it of all regulations so they can get the assets, they'll do that. They kind of seem libertarian, anarcho-capitalist in that sense. But they've also found that if they can take over the government and just grab the resources that way, they'll do it, which seems right more on the pro-government side. It doesn't make any difference to them. That's the way the Davos crowd, a lot of people call them, operate, and that's who's really running the world. And they've learned to do it through this mesh of the media, these NGO think tank, civil society groups, right? Which, by the way, are not out in force for Julian and should be, but they're not, of course, because they're part of it. And then through just explicit government and corporate action as well. But I think the point Kathy made is very, very salient, because it becomes a problem as a journalist. How do you deal with people? How do you explain a story to people who don't even see beyond the paradigm? And that's the problem that I think everybody who's trying to tell the truth right now in journalism faces. And I just want to thank, it's always an honor to be on with everybody here, Kathy and Gareth and Joe, and really appreciate it, and free Julian.
Well, thank you, Lee, for that. And you know a lot of that. We know a lot of that because of the work that WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, and their whistleblowers give us. So we're going to end the program now with the 20-minute interview that I did with Ambassador Tony Kevin of Australia. Can you roll that, Joe? And thank you, everyone. Unity for J. Vigil. I'm speaking to you from you in Sydney and Canberra. Where are you speaking to us from?
From Canberra in Australia.
You're in Canberra, in the capital. Okay. So thanks again for joining us. So you are one of the few former or current government officials anywhere in the world, really, who have spoken out on behalf of Julian Assange. And my question is, when did you first decide to do this, and why?
It was shortly after the Bradley Manning disclosures of the terrible massacre from the air in Iraq, and the publication of that in WikiLeaks. I became very interested in Julian Assange's positive role in world affairs.
And when did you first make known your views about him, and what was your position at the time?
Oh, from the very beginning, Joe, I was determined to say that this man is performing a public service in the interests of free expression and journalism, and I made that known through my social media opportunities.
While you were still serving the Australian government?
No, I retired in 1998.
What was your reaction? What were the reactions from people to your call? Was it all positive or negative, or probably a mix, right?
Julian Assange is a very polarizing figure in Australia. There are people who think he's a traitor to our alliance with the United States, which protects us, and there are people who think that he's a fighter for human rights and freedom. People do fall into those two camps pretty quickly, and I'm in the latter camp, which I'm glad to say seems to be growing.
And the negative reactions, were they quite fierce? Because if you'd stand up for Julian Assange today, it's gotten to be, maybe in those days when you first started, but certainly since the 2016 election in the U.S., the idea is that he somehow was a traitor to the Democratic Party, not to the United States so much. So has that increased your the reactions to you, negative reactions to you?
Yes, it has. It has all got hooked up in the current climate of anti-Trump Russophobia, the determination to see Putin at the in
center of all things.
Yeah, center of all things. There's a wonderful song by Randy Newman about it called Putin, 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 and I think it's all gone slightly mad, frankly. I can see no connections between Assange and Russia. Unlike some people, I mean, obviously Ed Snowden has a strong connection with Russia now because they gave him refuge. Fair enough. There's no sign of them having offered or given refuge to Julian Assange. The people who should be protecting him are his own government, Australia.
Well, that leads me to my next question. Why have so few government officials, even former ones, come out in his defense? And why isn't the government of Australia doing what you believe, I think, is their legal obligation to protect one of their citizens?
You could also include in your condemnation list there the official Australian opposition party, the Labor Party, which looks set to take government in a very few months because the Liberal Party are now dead men walking. But all of our conventional mainstream politics is very much constrained by the very close strategic alliance with the United States, which now penetrates, rather like Britain, into all areas of our political life. We have a thing called Five Eyes intelligence sharing, which has in recent years become public. It used to be very secret. And under Five Eyes, we have an obligation to share intelligence assessments with the US, Britain, Canada, and New Zealand. Now, there's no legal obligation under Five Eyes to connive in the persecution of Julian Assange, but it creates an enormous background pressure in the minds of our public officials. My gosh, we'd better not do anything to upset the Americans.
But as a government official, they have interests to protect, powerful interests, usually interests even more powerful than their own, behind them. There has to be some part of the thinking, even in Australia, why they don't want to stand up for Assange and why he can be thrown to the wolves, basically, because he's a danger to powerful people.
Yes, well, unfortunately, because the American Justice Department and the very powerful deep state forces in Washington have defined Assange as a danger and defined him as a person somehow connected to the archenemy Russia, they feel constrained by that. Considerations of his human rights don't seem to be prevailing, although there are plenty of examples of Australians in trouble overseas where human rights considerations have prevailed. I'm thinking of Peter Greste, the Australian journalist who was wrongfully imprisoned in Egypt for several years. I'm also thinking of Ricketson, James Ricketson, the Australian journalist detained wrongfully by the Cambodian government. Our government fought for those people's freedom and return to Australia, and there's no reason why, and a lot of Australians believe this, there's no reason why the Australian government shouldn't be fighting for Assange's return from his 8 years of temporary and increasingly dangerous asylum in the Ecuador embassy in London.
You know, WikiLeaks has revealed files on many, many governments around the world, revealing corruption, crimes, whatnot. They also have revealed files about the Australian government. But you seem to think that it's more the relationship with the U.S., not wanting to get on the wrong side of of Washington that's really behind the inaction of the Australian government. Is that right?
That's right. I don't think that Assange has in any way directly embarrassed the Australian government. I can't think of any major case, although I don't know whether WikiLeaks had anything to do with recent problems over East Timor. I don't think so, but I could be wrong on that.
So they just want to, why is the Australian relationship, I mean, so important? Sorry, the relationship with the U.S. so important to the Australian government when there is no threats to Australia in your region. China is not threatening Australia. What do they need the United States so much for, in your opinion? That they would let one of their own citizens hang out there like that.
The Australian government has conditioned itself, and I'm afraid the opposition has too, to think that we are a very strategically vulnerable country and that China is potentially a threat, as is unbelievably Russia on the other side of the world, and that we need to cling closely to nurse for fear of something worse. It's a very childish, dependent sort of relationship, and speaking as a former Australian ambassador, I'm ashamed of it. We should be standing up for ourselves and making our own foreign policy choices.
Sounds like a classic case of politicians creating a false threat, and then they are the ones that will protect the Australian people. And of course, we need the United States to do that. Now, in America, leaders have been doing this for a long time. Even during the first Cold War, they exaggerated the Soviet threat for a number of reasons. That's well documented now, and it's happening now in the second Cold War. And we also see in the first Cold War there was a McCarthyism where free speech or anybody who opposed American interests or American policy was branded as pro-Russia. And we're seeing it again today. If you don't buy the story, if you simply want détente with the United States without having to love anything about Russia, but simply not wanting tensions between the two nuclear superpowers, you're being smeared again as a Russia lover. It's the same thing happening again as we saw before. But I think, again, we're seeing, it sounds like what you're saying is Australian leaders are telling their people, look, we really need the U.S. to protect us. We've got to be involved with them. And are the Australian people buying that? And how do they buy that? And what role does the media play in that?
Right, that's a good question. Like America, we have a thing called Inside the Beltway. We don't call it that, but we have the same thing. We have a political, journalistic elite around our capital city where I live, Canberra, which comes to common judgments on these sorts of things. The Australian people, once you get outside that elite, still have a sense of decency, still have a sense of fair play, and will not buy this shit, excuse my language on air. But unfortunately, inside the Canberra Beltway, there is this realpolitik, so-called realistic wisdom. Actually, it's completely unrealistic that, look, whatever Assange has or has not done, he's expendable, and we have to stay on the right side of Washington. And in Washington at the moment, there's obviously a very strong anti-Trump, anti-Russia, anti-China drive, and we have to go with the flow of that.
You know, here in the U.S., even the New York Times understands the danger of Assange being prosecuted. They may not like him, and their number 2 legal counsel said this in a speech to some judges on the west coast of the U.S. a couple of months ago, that we don't like Assange, but we don't want him to be prosecuted because they can come after us, especially this particular administration in Washington now, because we do the same thing Assange has done, which is publish classified information. So if they get him, they can get us. So we really but they don't come out in the editorial pages in defense of Assange either. But we know that from that speech. How does the media, at least the non-Murdoch media in Australia, understand that if Assange is prosecuted for publishing true information, that they could be in trouble at some point down the road?
There's no sign of it. I'm working very hard through alternative social media to try and get people to think of those highly relevant comparisons, to think of Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. Under the current logic, Ellsberg should still be in jail. To think of Woodward and Bernstein and the Watergate break-ins. Woodward and Bernstein should be in jail. We had an Australian called David Hicks. Now, his case has almost no comparison to Assange's, but the one important comparison is that Hicks was several years in Guantanamo as a suspected Taliban supporter. The Australian government under John Howard did not lift a finger to protect him or to bring him home. Strangely enough, it was left in the end to an American military lawyer, Michael Morey, a hero, I think, to fight for Assange under American law in American courts. Sorry, to fight for Hicks under American law in American courts, and to succeed in him being released and brought home, much to the chagrin and embarrassment of the Australian government, which had done absolutely nothing for David Hicks. So I want people in Australia to be aware of that historical comparison. It's highly relevant.
You think something like that could happen in Assange's case, where someone could step forward? Because right now, if he steps out of the embassy, he'll be arrested and most likely extradited. I don't think there's any chance that he won't be, and he'll probably never see the light of day again. What possible relief could there be? What way out is there? Do you see one for Assange right now?
There is a way out that I can see, which requires a certain exercise of courage and decency on the part of an Australian government, whether this one or the next one, which is, I hope, coming very soon. And that is for the Australian government to, first of all, make aggressive representations in London to have Assange's jumping bail charge set aside, because it's really a very minor charge now, because the Swedish government has withdrawn all prosecution. So he's simply up on a technical charge in Britain of jumping bail. Now, it wouldn't be beyond the capacity of the Australian High Commission in London, our embassy there, to prevail upon the British government to waive that or set it aside. The next step would be, and I don't want to sound like a John le Carré novel, but things happen, would be for the Australian High Commissioner to drive in his car to the Ecuador embassy to pick up Assange, to drive him under High Commissioner's protection, possibly with a British police escort, straight to Heathrow Airport onto the tarmac, onto a waiting Australian Qantas plane, because we actually have a direct Qantas flight, the Australian National Airline, from London to Perth without stops. And once Assange is on that plane, there is no way he could be touched by the Americans until he gets to Perth. It would then become an issue for the Australian government and the American government what to do with Assange. But I believe that no Australian government would dare to extradite Assange to the United States without a proper legal process, without a proper charge tested in an Australian court.
But do you think that could really happen legally, that once he steps out of the embassy, he's on British territory? I don't think the Australian government has legal rights over even an Australian citizen in another country's sovereign territory. Is that right?
Well, if the Australian ambassador, High Commissioner, walked into the Ecuador embassy and walked out hand in hand with Assange and put him straight into an embassy car, I cannot see Assange being arrested. If the Australian government had taken the legal steps beforehand of clearing it with the British government to say, look, this is ridiculous, we're going to take him home.
I don't think they'd be able to clear it with the British government very easily, would they? I mean, the power relationship is certainly the other way around. Britain has traditionally more power over Australia.
I would question
and they're in
that.
Britain. And they're in Britain.
I would question that. The British government, is on the ropes, and they're very weak at the moment. And I think a firm and assertive defence of Australia's citizens' consular rights, as in the case of other countries, Cambodia and Egypt, would actually work if the Australian government had the gumption to push this to the point where it needs to be pushed.
Oh, I'd love to see them try it and see if I don't know if the British police would give them an escort. They might set up a roadblock. That's me.
Well, I'm pushing this proposal seriously, because what else have we got? I mean,
it's brilliant. I haven't heard that one before, actually. I've heard a lot of silly ideas, but that one's not silly. Yeah.
The alternative is just to wait for Assange to starve, to freeze to death, or to give up. Whatever the alternatives are, they're very bad. So this is an argument for trying something.
I think I may have left out something in the Australian-U.S. relationship that could be important, and you'd know more about this. What kind of aid comes from the U.S. to Australia, particularly the military and the intelligence services?
Well, the intelligence aid is something of a poison chalice, because it means we're exposed 24/7 to American disinformation and propaganda about the world, and naturally it influences our strategic community in negative ways. We've lost our independence of strategic assessment, I believe. We don't have any aid from America. They don't do us any favours. In fact, we do them a few favours. We host a very important electronic listening post and control post in Central Australia near Alice Springs at a place called Pine Gap, which is a top nuclear target in the event of a nuclear exchange between America and either Russia or China. Pine Gap is used for targeting, for satellite, for surveillance, for everything, and it would be a top-ranked target. So we also have an American visiting base. It's a constantly rotating presence of the US Marines in Darwin in Northern Australia. So we host American bases in Australia. I don't think we owe the Americans anything, really, except our imaginary security guarantee. We have this fond belief that if we are attacked by anybody, they will come to our assistance. There is no guarantee of that whatsoever.
Well, that's what I was just thinking. What does Australia get out of this? Even in the Five Eyes arrangement, you're pretty much obliged to give stuff to them, but they're not necessarily going to give you things that the Australian security services might need. Correct?
Well, they give us mountains of stuff, but it's as I said a moment ago, they give us mountains of stuff, but it's all the American view of the world, which is a very suspect view at the moment.
Ultimately, it comes down to a question of Australia asserting its sovereignty as an independent nation against anyone, including the United States. And they would have to do that to defy America, who wants Assange more than anyone, especially the CIA after Vault 7. So they are doing the bidding of the U.S. and not getting much in return, just to sum up what we've been saying here. Is that right?
You've hit the nail on the head. Australia needs to reassert its belief, which we had in 1949 when we helped negotiate the UN Charter and the UN Security Council rules. We need to reaffirm our belief in multipolarity, in a concert of independent and sovereign nations who come together in the cause of international security. We have to get away from this idea of us and them, that we are the good guys and Russia and China are the bad guys. There are no good guys, there are no bad guys. There's simply a multipolar world in which Australia as a middle power has to navigate its way. I'm not saying we should be anti-American, of course not, or anti-British, but we need to rediscover our independence of outlook. And if Assange came home to Australia, obviously he's not going to be doing WikiLeaks stuff from Australia, but he would be a very important voice in Australia's public foreign policy debate, and I would welcome that voice.
Well, I've been talking to Ambassador Tony Kevin from Canberra, Australia, and I really thank you so much for giving us just a few minutes to take part in the vigil for Julian Assange. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
All the best. Bye-bye.